Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. As you settle in tonight, let yourself imagine the weight of paper beneath your fingertips, the soft whisper of pages turning, the gentle rhythm of documentation that transforms chaos into order. Close your eyes and drift with me into the quiet world of police reports, where every detail finds its place. The report forms had remained essentially unchanged for decades. Their layout is familiar to officers as the geography of their own neighborhoods. Incident number in the upper right corner, date and time in careful block letters across the top, the victim's name spelled out with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Detective Michael Torres had filled out thousands of these forms during his career, his handwriting evolving from the uncertain scrawl of a rookie to the efficient, legible script of a veteran officer who understood that these documents might be read years or even decades after the incidents they described. Tonight, he sat at his desk in the detective division, the soft glow of his desk lamp creating a pool of warm light in the otherwise dim office. The rest of the building had settled into its night rhythm, the day shift long gone, the patrol officers out on their rounds through the quiet streets of the city. This was the time when paperwork could be completed without interruption, when the steady work of documentation could proceed at its own natural pace. The case he was working on had been closed for 3 days, but the reports required the same careful attention, whether they dealt with ongoing investigations or matters that had been resolved. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had reported the theft of her purse from the downtown library, a simple incident that had been solved. When security cameras revealed the identity of the teenager who had taken it while she was distracted at the computer terminals, Detective Torres began with the initial incident report, dating it back to the Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Vasquez had first discovered her purse missing. She had been using one of the library's public computers to research information about her grandson's school project, a report on local history that required access to newspaper archives that were only available in digital format. Her purse had been sitting on the chair beside her, and she had become so absorbed in her research that she had failed to notice when someone had quietly lifted it and walked away. The theft had been discovered when Mrs. Vasquez finished her research and reached for her purse to retrieve her car keys. The initial panic, the quick search of the surrounding area, the growing realization that the purse was indeed gone. All of this had to be documented with the same methodical care that characterized every police report. Detective Torres described the location within the library, the time of day, the number of people present, the lighting conditions, all the environmental factors that might have contributed to creating an opportunity for theft. Mrs. Vasquez had approached the library's circulation desk, where the staff had immediately called security and then contacted the police. The responding officer, Patrolman Williams, had arrived within 12 minutes of the call, his response time duly noted in the report along with the exact time of his arrival and the initial assessment he had made of the situation. The interview with Mrs. Vasquez had been conducted in the library's small conference room, away from the curious glances of other patrons. Patrolman Williams had taken careful note of her description of the purse, a black leather handbag with a distinctive silver clasp that had belonged to her mother. Inside had been her driver's license, credit cards, $43 in cash, photographs of her grandchildren, and a small address book that contained phone numbers accumulated over decades of family and social connections. Detective Torres transcribed Patrolman Williams' notes with the same attention to detail that the original officer had brought to gathering the information. The value of the stolen items was calculated not just in monetary terms, but in the broader impact on Mrs. Vasquez's life. The loss of identification would require visits to the Department of Motor Vehicles. The credit cards would need to be canceled and replaced. The photographs were irreplaceable mementos of family occasions that could never be reproduced. The investigation had proceeded according to standard procedures, with library security reviewing footage from the cameras positioned throughout the building. Detective Torres had worked with the security supervisor to identify the relevant time, period, and examine the recordings from multiple angles. The process had been methodical and time-consuming, requiring hours of careful viewing to track Mrs. Vasquez's movements and identify the moment when the theft had occurred. The security footage had revealed a clear sequence of events. At 2:17 p.m., Mrs. Vasquez had settled at computer terminal 7, placing her purse on the adjacent chair before becoming absorbed in her research. At 2:34 p.m., a young man in a blue jacket had approached the area, apparently browsing the nearby shelves. At 2:39 p.m., while Mrs. Vasquez was focused on the computer screen, the same young man had casually lifted her purse and walked toward the library's main exit. Detective Torres included detailed descriptions of the suspect as revealed by the security footage. Approximately 16 to 18 years old, medium height and build, wearing a blue denim jacket over a white t-shirt, dark jeans, and white sneakers. The young man had moved through the library with apparent familiarity, suggesting that he was a regular patron rather than someone who had entered specifically to commit theft. The investigation had continued, with Detective Torres reviewing the library's records of recent visitors, working with staff to identify young men who matched the suspect's general description and who had been in the building during the relevant time period. This process had required careful coordination with library administration, ensuring that patron privacy was protected while still allowing the investigation to proceed effectively. Breakthrough had come through patient detective work rather than dramatic revelation. Detective Torres had spoken with library staff members who worked regularly with the teenage population that used the building's study areas and computer terminals. Several staff members had recognized the suspect's description, identifying him as Marcus Chen, a 17-year-old high school student who visited the library several times each week to use the computers and study areas. Marcus lived with his grandmother in a small apartment 6 blocks from the library, within easy walking distance. That explained his regular presence in the building. Detective Torres had approached the family's apartment with the same careful attention to procedure that characterized all aspects of the investigation. The initial contact had been made through Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Helen Chun, who had expressed both shock and disappointment upon learning of the allegations against her grandson. The interview with Marcus had been conducted in the presence of his grandmother, with Detective Torres taking care to explain the young man's rights and the nature of the charges he was facing. Marcus had initially denied any involvement in the theft, but when confronted with the security footage, he had admitted to taking Mrs. Vasquez's purse in what he described as an impulsive decision driven by his need for money to buy lunch. Detective Torres documented Marcus's explanation with the same thorough attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the case. The young man had been struggling with the shame of his family's financial difficulties, too proud to ask his grandmother for lunch money when he knew she was already working 2 part-time jobs to support them both. The theft had not been planned or premeditated, but had occurred when Marcus saw an opportunity and made a poor decision in a moment of desperation. The recovery of Mrs. Vasquez's purse had required additional investigation, as Marcus had disposed of it in a dumpster behind a fast food restaurant after removing the cash. Detective Torres had worked with sanitation workers to locate and retrieve the purse, which had been damaged by exposure to food waste and liquids, but still contained most of Mrs. Vasquez's important documents and personal items. The resolution of the case had involved coordination between Detective Torres, the juvenile court system, and social services agencies that could address the underlying issues that had contributed to Marcus's poor decision, rather than simply processing the young man through the criminal justice system. Detective Torres had worked to ensure that Marcus received appropriate support and guidance while also making restitution to Mrs. Vasquez for the inconvenience and distress he had caused. Final reports documented a resolution that addressed both the immediate crime and the broader circumstances that had contributed to it. Marcus had been required to write a formal letter of apology to Mrs. Vasquez, explaining his actions and expressing genuine remorse for the distress he had caused. He had also been assigned community service hours to be completed at the same library where the theft had occurred, working with staff to shelve books and assist with programs for younger children. Mrs. Vasquez had been contacted throughout the process, her wishes and concerns taken into account as the case moved toward resolution. Detective Torres documented her initial anger and fear, her growing understanding of Marcus's circumstances, and her eventual agreement to a resolution that emphasized education and support rather than punishment. She had even offered to meet with Marcus personally, hoping that her forgiveness might provide him with motivation to make better choices in the future. The paperwork for this case filled 17 pages, each one carefully typed and reviewed before being filed in the case folder that would eventually join the thousands of other folders in the basement archives. Detective Torres took pride in the completeness and accuracy of his documentation, understanding that these reports served not just as legal records, but as detailed accounts of human interactions that might provide valuable insights for future investigations. Moving on to his next case, Detective Torres pulled the file for a vandalism incident that had occurred the previous week at Jefferson Elementary School. Someone had spray-painted obscenities on the side of the building that faced the playground, creating a situation that required immediate attention due to the school's concern about exposing young children to inappropriate language. The initial report had been filed by the school's principal, Mrs. Margaret Foster, who had discovered the vandalism when she arrived for work on Monday morning. The graffiti consisted of several crude words spray-painted in black paint across a section of brick wall that was clearly visible from the playground equipment where children played during recess and before school. Officer Patricia Davis had responded to the call, conducting the initial investigation with the same methodical approach that characterized all police work at the precinct. She had photographed the vandalism from multiple angles, documenting not just the offensive language, but also the style of the spray painting, the type of paint used, and the height at which the words had been applied to the wall. Detective Torres transcribed Officer Davis's observations with careful attention to detail. The vandalism appeared to have been completed quickly, with minimal artistic pretension and no apparent signature or tag that might identify the perpetrator. The height of the spray painting suggested that it had been done by someone of average adult height or a tall teenager, and the somewhat shaky quality of the lettering indicated either nervousness or inexperience with spray paint as a medium. The investigation had proceeded through interviews with school staff and neighbors who lived near the elementary school. Detective Torres documented each conversation, noting the times and dates of the interviews and the specific information provided by each person. The school's custodian, Mr. Robert Martinez, had mentioned seeing teenagers in the area on Saturday evening, though he had not paid close attention to their specific activities or appearances. Mrs. Sarah Kim, who lived in a house adjacent to the school property, had heard what sounded like spray painting late on Saturday night, a rhythmic hissing sound that had continued for several minutes. She had looked out her window but had not seen anyone in the darkened area where the vandalism was later discovered. Her description of the timing matched other evidence that suggested the vandalism had occurred sometime between 10 p.m. Saturday and 6 a.m. Monday. The breakthrough in the case had come through the school's own security measures rather than traditional detective work. Jefferson Elementary had recently installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of the building, a response to previous incidents of vandalism and concerns about unauthorized access to the playground equipment. Detective Torres had worked with the school's technology coordinator to review footage from the cameras that covered the area where the vandalism had occurred. The security footage had provided clear evidence of the crime, showing two teenage boys approaching the wall at approximately 11:30 p.m. on Saturday night. The image quality was sufficient to identify distinctive clothing and general physical characteristics, though the lighting conditions made facial identification difficult. One of the boys had carried a can of spray paint, while the other had apparently served as a lookout during the brief time required to complete the vandalism. Detective Torres documented the security footage with the same attention to detail that characterized all evidence in the case. The boys appeared to be between 14 and 17 years old, both wearing dark clothing that made them difficult to see in the nighttime environment. The boy with the spray paint had completed the vandalism quickly, suggesting either prior experience with graffiti or a simple desire to finish the task and leave the area as quickly as possible. The identification of the suspects had required additional investigative work, with Detective Torres visiting the nearby high school to speak with administrators and security personnel who might recognize the boys from the security footage. This process had been complicated by the need to balance investigative necessity with student privacy concerns, requiring careful coordination with school officials and parents. The investigation had eventually led to the identification of Tommy Rodriguez and Jake Wilson, both 16-year-old students at the local high school who lived within walking distance of Jefferson Elementary. Detective Torres had interviewed both boys separately, documenting their initial denials and their eventual admissions of guilt when confronted with the security footage evidence. The resolution of the case had involved the boys' parents, the school administration, and community service coordinators who could provide appropriate consequences that would address both the immediate damage and the underlying issues that had led to the vandalism. Tommy and Jake had been required to clean not just their own graffiti, but to participate in a broader beautification project at Jefferson Elementary, working under supervision to paint over other vandalism and plant flowers around the school's entrance. Detective Torres documented the boys' participation in the community service project, noting their apparent genuine remorse and their positive interactions with younger students who watched them work. The principal, Mrs. Foster, had reported that the boys had asked thoughtful questions about the impact of vandalism on school morale and had seemed to understand how their actions had affected the entire school community. The paperwork for the vandalism case required careful documentation of the evidence, the investigation process, and the ultimate resolution. Detective Torres included photographs of the original graffiti, copies of the security footage, transcripts of interviews with witnesses and suspects, and detailed reports on the community service activities that had served as restitution for the crime. Each page of documentation served a specific purpose in the larger system of justice and community accountability. The reports would be reviewed by supervisors, filed in the archives for future reference, and potentially examined by researchers studying patterns of juvenile crime and effective intervention strategies. Detective Torres understood that his careful documentation contributed to a body of knowledge that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of any individual case. The next case in his stack involved a more complex situation that had required extensive documentation over several weeks. Mrs. Dorothy Kim had reported that someone was regularly going through her garbage cans, creating a mess in her driveway and apparently searching for specific items among her discarded materials. What had initially seemed like a simple trespassing matter had evolved into a case that required careful investigation and creative problem solving. The initial report, filed by Officer Linda Martinez, had documented Mrs. Kim's frustration with the ongoing intrusions into her property. Every Tuesday morning, after the garbage trucks had emptied her cans, Mrs. Kim would find the containers overturned and their contents scattered across her driveway. The mess included not just the normal detritus of household Waste, but also personal documents that had been removed from bags and scattered in what appeared to be a systematic search. Detective Torres had taken over the case when it became clear that simple trespassing charges would not address the ongoing nature of the problem. His investigation had begun with a careful analysis of what items were being targeted by whoever was searching through Mrs. Kim's garbage. The pattern that emerged suggested someone was looking for documents that contained personal information, bank statements, credit card offers, utility bills, and other materials that might be useful for identity theft. The investigation had required surveillance of Mrs. Kim's property, with Detective Torres and other officers taking turns monitoring the area during the early morning hours when the intrusions typically occurred. This process had been complicated by the need to remain unobserved while still maintaining clear sight lines to Mrs. Kim's driveway and garbage cans. The surveillance had revealed that the perpetrator was Mrs. Kim's next-door neighbor, Gerald Foster, a 62-year-old retired accountant who had been struggling with mounting gambling debts and had turned to identity theft as a way to obtain quick cash. Detective Torres documented the surveillance observations with careful attention to times, dates, and specific activities that had been witnessed. The arrest of Gerald Foster had been handled with the discretion appropriate to a neighborhood situation where the parties would continue to live in close proximity regardless of the legal resolution. Detective Torres had coordinated with patrol officers to make the arrest during daylight hours when other neighbors were less likely to observe the police activity, and had worked to minimize the drama and publicity that might have made the situation more difficult for both families. The investigation had revealed the extent of Gerald Foster's identity theft activities, which had extended beyond Mrs. Kim to include several other neighbors whose garbage he had also been searching. Detective Torres documented each instance of theft and fraud, working with financial institutions and other agencies to determine the full scope of the crimes and their impact on the victims. The resolution of the case had required coordination with social services agencies that could address Gerald Foster's gambling addiction while also ensuring that he made appropriate restitution to his victims. Detective Torres documented the complex legal and social service interventions that had been necessary to address both the immediate crimes and the underlying issues that had contributed to them. Mrs. Kim had been kept informed throughout the process, her concerns and preferences taken into account as the case moved toward resolution. Detective Torres documented her initial shock at learning that her neighbor was responsible for the intrusions, her growing understanding of the circumstances that had led to his criminal behavior, and her eventual agreement to a resolution that emphasized treatment and restitution rather than imprisonment. The paperwork for this case had grown to over 30 pages, documenting not just the criminal investigation, but also the complex social and legal interventions that had been necessary to address the underlying issues. Detective Torres understood that this level of documentation was essential for ensuring that all parties understood their roles and responsibilities in the ongoing resolution of the case. As the night progressed, Detective Torres continued working through his stack of cases, each one requiring the same careful attention to detail and thorough documentation. A bicycle theft from the community college campus had been solved when the thief attempted to sell the stolen bike to a shop whose owner recognized it from a police bulletin. A series of mailbox vandalism incidents had been traced to a group of middle school students who had been acting out their frustration with recent changes in their school's disciplinary policies. Each case, regardless of its apparent simplicity or complexity, received the same methodical treatment in Detective Torres's reports. Every witness interview was transcribed completely. Every piece of evidence was documented with photographs and detailed descriptions. Every step in the investigation was recorded with precise times and dates. This approach ensured that the reports would serve not just as legal documents, but as comprehensive records of police work that could be studied and learned from by future generations of officers. The steady rhythm of typing continued through the early morning hours. The sound of the typewriter keys creating a sort of mechanical poetry that marked the transformation of human experience into official documentation. Detective Torres had long since ceased to think consciously about the individual keystrokes, his fingers moving automatically to create the precise language that police reports required. The reports he created would join the thousands of other documents in the precinct's filing system, each one a small piece in the larger mosaic of community life and law enforcement. Together, they formed a comprehensive record of how ordinary people navigated the challenges and conflicts that were inevitable in any society, and how the institutions of law enforcement worked to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective security. As dawn approached and the night shift prepared to hand over responsibility to their day shift colleagues, Detective Torres completed his final report and gathered the finished documents into neat stacks for filing. The steady work of documentation had transformed another night's collection of human dramas into the ordered language of official records, ensuring that each story would be preserved with the dignity and attention it deserved. The reports would be reviewed, filed, and eventually archived, joining the vast collection of documents that chronicled the ongoing effort to maintain justice and order in their community. In the quiet efficiency of this process, Detective Torres found a deep satisfaction that came not from dramatic arrests or high-profile cases, but from the knowledge that he had contributed to the careful, methodical work of documentation that made civilization possible. The basement level of the precinct building extended further than most officers realized, branching into corridors that housed archives dating back to the 1940s. Records. Clerk Margaret Holloway had spent the better part of 3 decades navigating these quiet passages, her soft footsteps echoing gently against concrete walls painted in that institutional green that had once been considered calming. She knew every cabinet, every filing system, every organizational change that had been implemented over the years to accommodate the endless accumulation of human stories that found their way into police files. On this particular evening, Margaret had been tasked with conducting an inventory of files from the 1960s, a periodic review required to ensure that documents were properly preserved and that the slow deterioration of paper and ink had not compromised the legibility of important records. The work was methodical and peaceful, requiring the kind of focused attention that she had always found deeply satisfying. The first cabinet she opened contained cases from 1963, the year President Kennedy was assassinated. Though the events documented in these local files seemed to exist in a different world entirely from the dramatic headlines that had dominated that autumn, here were the small dramas of everyday life: domestic disputes, minor thefts, traffic accidents that had required police attention but had never made the newspapers. Margaret pulled the first file, noting the way the manila folder had aged to a warm cream color, its edges softened by decades of careful handling. The typewritten label identified it as case number 630847, a missing person report filed in September of that year. Inside, she found the careful documentation of Officer James McCarthy's investigation into the disappearance of Mrs. Rose Kowalski, a 42-year-old seamstress who had failed to return home from her job at the downtown dress shop. The initial report, typed on the heavy paper that had been standard in that era, described Mrs. Kowalski as a reliable employee and devoted mother who had never before failed to come home without explanation. Her husband, Stanley, had waited until nearly midnight before calling the police, hoping that some simple explanation would present itself for his wife's unusual absence. Officer McCarthy's investigation had begun with interviews at the dress shop where Mrs. Kowalski worked, a small establishment called Miller's Fashions that specialized in custom alterations and simple repairs. The shop owner, Mrs. Helen Miller, had described Rose as punctual and conscientious, someone who took pride in her work and rarely spoke of problems in her personal life. Margaret read through Officer McCarthy's careful notes, documenting his conversations with Mrs. Kowalski's co-workers and customers. The seamstress had finished her work for the day at her usual time, 5:30 p.m., and had gathered her purse and light jacket before saying goodbye to the other employees. Several people had seen her walking toward the bus stop that would take her home to the Polish neighborhood where she lived with her husband and 3 children. The investigation had expanded to include interviews with bus drivers and passengers who might have seen Mrs. Kowalski during her commute. Officer McCarthy had spent hours at the central bus terminal, speaking with drivers who worked the route that Mrs. Kowalski typically took home. His reports documented the patient process of elimination that characterized police work of that era, checking each possible explanation before moving on to more serious possibilities. The breakthrough had come through the kind of community connection that was more common in the 1960s than it would be in later decades. Mrs. Agnes Novak, who lived 2 blocks from the Kowalski family, had seen Rose getting off the bus at her usual stop, but had then observed her walking in the opposite direction from her home. This seemed unusual enough to mention when Officer McCarthy canvassed the neighborhood, seeking anyone who might have seen Mrs. Kowalski after she left work. Following this lead, Officer McCarthy had discovered that Mrs. Kowalski had visited St. Mary's Hospital, where her elderly mother had been admitted earlier that day following a fall at home. The hospital visit had not been planned, and Mrs. Kowalski had been so concerned about her mother's condition that she had forgotten to call home and inform her family of the delay. The resolution of the case had been both simple and touching. Mrs. Kowalski had spent the evening at her mother's bedside, losing track of time as she helped the older woman navigate the unfamiliar and somewhat frightening environment of the hospital. When she finally realized how late it had become, she had tried to call home but had been unable to reach her husband, who had already left to search for her and contact the police. Margaret found a handwritten note clipped to the final report, apparently added by Officer McCarthy after the case had been closed. He had written that the reunion between Mrs. Kowalski and her worried family had taken place in the hospital lobby, with Stanley and the children arriving just as Rose was preparing to leave. The note described the relief and joy of that moment, the way worry had transformed instantly into celebration, and the gratitude that the entire family had expressed for the careful attention Officer McCarthy had given to their situation. The file also contained a letter from Mrs. Kowalski herself, written several days after the incident, to thank Officer McCarthy for his kindness and thoroughness. She had explained that her mother's condition had improved significantly, and that the family had established better procedures for communicating during emergencies to prevent similar misunderstandings. In the future, Margaret carefully returned the Kowalski file to its proper place and reached for the next folder in the cabinet. This one contained documentation of a burglary investigation from the winter of 1963, when someone had broken into Peterson's hardware store and stolen tools and supplies worth approximately $200, a significant sum for a small business in that era. The investigating officer, Detective William Foster, had approached the case with the methodical patience that characterized police work before the pressures of modern caseloads had made such thorough investigations less common. His initial report described the scene he had found when responding to the alarm that had been triggered during the early morning hours of a cold February day. The burglar had entered through a rear window that faced an alley, carefully removing the glass rather than breaking it, suggesting someone with experience in this type of crime. Once inside, the perpetrator had focused on hand tools and small electrical items that could be easily carried and quickly sold. Detective Foster had noted that the selection of stolen items showed knowledge of their value and marketability, indicating that this was likely not the work of a desperate amateur. Investigation had proceeded through interviews with neighboring business owners and residents who might have observed unusual activity in the area during the relevant time period. Detective Foster had documented conversations with the owner of the adjacent bakery, who arrived early each morning to begin preparing bread and pastries, and with the night watchman at the nearby factory, whose rounds took him past the hardware store several times during each shift. Margaret found herself impressed by the thoroughness of Detective Foster's investigation, the way he had considered every possible angle and followed up on even the smallest leads. He had examined the tools and techniques used in the break-in, consulted with other officers about similar crimes in neighboring jurisdictions, and even researched the backgrounds of recently released prisoners who had histories of burglary. The solution to the case had come through the kind of community cooperation that was more common in smaller cities during the 1960s. The stolen tools had begun appearing at pawn shops throughout the region, and Detective Foster had worked with pawn shop owners to trace the items back to their source. This process had required considerable time and patience, as the perpetrator had been careful to spread the stolen goods across multiple shops to avoid detection. The trail had eventually led to Robert Chun, a 34-year-old unemployed factory worker who had been struggling to support his family after being laid off from his job at the steel plant. Detective Foster's reports described Chun as a man who had turned to burglary not out of criminal intent, but out of desperation. Someone who had made poor choices while facing financial pressures that seemed overwhelming. The resolution of the case had reflected the more personal approach to law enforcement that characterized that era. Detective Foster had worked with Chun's family, his former employer, and social service agencies to address the underlying issues that had led to the crime, rather than simply processing Chun through the criminal justice system. Detective Foster had helped arrange job training and temporary financial assistance that allowed Chun to make restitution while also rebuilding his life. Margaret found a follow-up report dated 6 months after Chun's arrest, documenting his successful completion of a welding course and his employment at a construction company that was involved in the urban renewal projects that were transforming the city during that period. Peterson's hardware store had received full restitution for the stolen items, and Mr. Peterson had even offered Chun a part-time job helping with deliveries, recognizing that people deserved second chances when they demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to change. The next file contained documentation of a case that had stretched across several months in 1963, involving a series of vandalism incidents at Lincoln High School. Someone had been entering the building after hours and damaging classroom equipment, creating disruptions that affected the education of hundreds of students and placed financial strain on the school. District's limited budget officer Patricia Davis had been assigned to the case, working closely with school administrators and custodial staff to understand the patterns of the vandalism and identify potential suspects. Her reports documented the systematic nature of the damage, which had focused on science laboratory equipment and art supplies, suggesting that the perpetrator was familiar with the school's layout and possibly had some connection to the educational programs being targeted. The investigation had required Officer Davis to spend considerable time at the school, observing the routines of students, teachers, and staff members who had access to the building during evening and weekend hours. Her reports described the careful process of building trust with various members of the school community, encouraging people to share information that might seem insignificant, but could prove crucial to solving the case. Margaret was struck by the patience and sensitivity that Officer Davis had brought to the investigation. Rather than approaching the school as an outsider investigating a crime, she had worked to understand the complex social dynamics that existed within the educational community, recognizing that the solution to the vandalism might require addressing underlying issues rather than simply identifying and arresting a perpetrator. The breakthrough in the case had come through Officer Davis's conversations with Mrs. Linda Morrison, a teacher who had noticed that one of her students, Michael Torres, had been displaying unusual behavior in recent weeks. Michael was normally an engaged and enthusiastic student, but he had become withdrawn and sullen, showing little interest in the science projects that had previously excited him. Officer Davis's investigation had revealed that Michael's family was facing eviction from their apartment, and that his father had been injured in an industrial accident that had left him unable to work. The teenager had been acting out his frustration and anger through the vandalism, targeting the school programs that had once brought him joy but now seemed like luxuries that his family could no longer afford to value. The resolution of the Michael Torres case had required collaboration between law enforcement, school administrators, and social service agencies. Officer Davis had worked to ensure that Michael received counseling and support to help him process his family's difficulties, while also arranging for him to make restitution through volunteer work that utilized his interests in science and art, rather than simply punishing him for his destructive behavior. Margaret found documentation showing that Michael had gone on to graduate from Lincoln High School and receive a scholarship to study engineering at the State University. Officer Davis had maintained contact with the family over the years, serving as both a law enforcement officer and a mentor who helped guide Michael through the challenges of adolescence and early adulthood. The archives contained dozens of similar cases from that era, each one reflecting the more personal approach to policing that had been possible when officers had smaller caseloads and more time to develop relationships within the communities they served. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the humanity and creativity that characterized so much of the police work documented from the 1960s. She pulled another file, this one dealing with a case of elderly abuse that had required delicate handling and extensive coordination with family members and social service agencies. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an 80-year-old widow, had been the victim of financial exploitation by her own grandson, who had been using his access to her home to steal money and valuables over a period of several months. Detective Robert Martinez had approached the case with particular sensitivity, understanding that family dynamics complicated the investigation in ways that made traditional law enforcement approaches inadequate. His reports documented careful conversations with Mrs. Kim, who had been reluctant to admit that her grandson was stealing from her, and with other family members who had suspected the theft, but had been unsure how to address it without destroying family relationships. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Kim's grandson, David Chun, was struggling with a gambling addiction that had led him to steal from the one person who had always shown him unconditional love and support. Detective Martinez had worked with addiction counselors and family therapists to develop a resolution that addressed David's underlying problems while also protecting Mrs. Kim from further victimization. Margaret read through the extensive documentation that Detective Martinez had created, recording not just the criminal aspects of the case, but also the complex emotional and social factors that had contributed to the situation. His approach had been more therapeutic than punitive, recognizing that simply arresting David would not solve the underlying problems that had led to his criminal behavior. The resolution had involved David entering a residential treatment program for gambling addiction, with the costs covered through a combination of family resources and public assistance programs. Mrs. Kim had been connected with senior citizen support services that provided regular check-ins and assistance with financial management, ensuring that she would be protected from future exploitation while maintaining her independence and dignity. As Margaret continued her inventory, she found case after case that reflected this more holistic approach to law enforcement, where officers saw their role as extending beyond simple crime fighting to include community building and social support. The files from the 1960s painted a picture of police work that was deeply embedded in community life, with officers serving as counselors, mediators, and advocates as well as law enforcement professionals. She pulled a file containing documentation of Officer Linda Wilson's investigation into a series of complaints about noise and disruption in the Riverside neighborhood. Rather than simply issuing citations for noise violations, Officer Wilson had worked to understand the cultural and generational differences that were creating conflict between longtime residents and newer arrivals to the area. The complaints had originated from several elderly residents who were disturbed by the music and social gatherings of Puerto Rican families who had recently moved to the neighborhood, seeking better employment opportunities. Officer Wilson's reports documented her patient efforts to bridge the cultural divide, organizing community meetings where residents could express their concerns and work together to find solutions that respected everyone's needs and rights. The resolution had involved the creation of community guidelines that addressed noise levels while also acknowledging the importance of cultural traditions and family gatherings. Officer Wilson had worked with community leaders from both groups to establish regular communication channels that could address future conflicts before they required police intervention. Margaret found follow-up reports showing that the Riverside neighborhood had become a model of successful integration, with longtime residents and newer arrivals working together on community improvement projects and social activities. Officer Wilson's patient approach had transformed what could have been an ongoing source of conflict into an opportunity for building stronger community bonds. The archives from this era were filled with similar success stories, cases where thoughtful police work had addressed not just immediate crimes, but also the underlying social conditions that contributed to community problems. Margaret found herself thinking about how different modern policing had become, with officers facing larger caseloads and more complex social problems, but having less time for the kind of relationship building that had characterized police work in the 1960s. She pulled one more file before taking a break from her inventory, this one documenting a shoplifting case that had evolved into something much more significant. Mrs. Sarah Torres, a 45-year-old mother of 4, had been caught stealing food from the local grocery store, taking items like bread, milk, and canned goods that suggested she was struggling to feed her family. Officer Michael Foster had responded to the call from the store manager, but rather than simply arresting Mrs. Torres, he had taken the time to understand the circumstances that had led to her desperate action. His investigation had revealed that Mrs. Torres's husband had been injured in a construction accident and was unable to work, leaving the family without income and facing eviction from their apartment. Officer Foster's reports documented his efforts to connect the Torres family with appropriate social services while also working with the grocery store to address their concerns about theft. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, he had arranged for Mrs. Torres to work part-time at the store to pay for the stolen items while also earning money to help support her family. The resolution had been beneficial for everyone involved. The Torres family had received the support they needed to weather their financial crisis. The grocery store had gained a reliable part-time employee, and the community had avoided the costs and trauma associated with prosecuting a desperate mother for trying to feed her children. Margaret carefully returned the final file to its place in the cabinet and sat back in her chair, reflecting on the stories she had encountered during her inventory. These archives represented more than just documentation of police work. They were records of a time when law enforcement was deeply integrated into community life, when officers had the time and latitude to address not just crimes, but also the social conditions that contributed to criminal behavior. The dust that had settled on these files over the decades seemed to Margaret like a gentle blanket, protecting these stories of human compassion and creative problem-solving from the harsher realities of modern law enforcement. Each folder contained lessons about the importance of patience, empathy, and community engagement in maintaining social order and promoting justice. As she prepared to move on to the next cabinet in her inventory, Margaret felt a deep appreciation for the officers whose work was documented in these archives. They had understood that effective policing required more than just enforcing laws. It required building relationships, understanding human nature, and working creatively to address the complex social problems that manifested as individual crimes. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting their steady glow across rows of filing cabinets that contained thousands of similar stories. Each file represented a moment when someone in crisis had encountered the justice system, and in most cases had found not just punishment, but also understanding, support, and hope for a better future. Margaret opened the next cabinet, ready to continue her journey through the archives, knowing that each file she examined would add to her understanding of how police work had evolved over the decades and how the lessons from earlier eras might inform approaches to contemporary challenges. In the quiet sanctuary of the archives, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations of police officers, she found both inspiration and guidance for the work that continued above them in the busy precincts of the modern era. The stories rested peacefully in their folders, each one a testament to the enduring importance of treating people with dignity and compassion, even in the midst of legal proceedings that could easily become impersonal and bureaucratic. In the gentle silence of the archives, these forgotten cases continued to offer their quiet lessons about the true meaning of justice and the endless possibility for human redemption. The old courthouse on Maple Street had been abandoned for 15 years, replaced by a modern judicial complex on the other side of town. But security guard Thomas Chen still walked its darkened halls each night, his footsteps creating a steady rhythm against marble floors that had been polished by decades of foot traffic. The building retained the dignity of its former purpose, its high ceilings and carved wooden panels, speaking of an era when public buildings were constructed as monuments to civic pride and the rule of law. Tonight, as Thomas made his rounds through the empty structure, his flashlight beam moved across familiar landmarks that told the story of countless legal proceedings that had unfolded within these walls. Courtroom A, where Judge Margaret Foster had presided for 32 years, still contained the heavy wooden furniture that had witnessed thousands of cases, ranging from minor traffic violations to serious felonies. The judge's bench sat empty now, but Thomas could almost hear the gentle authority of Judge Foster's voice as she had guided proceedings with patience and wisdom. The holding cells in the basement had been cleaned and secured when the courthouse was decommissioned, but they retained the institutional atmosphere that had made them a place of temporary confinement for people awaiting their appearances before the judge. Thomas remembered when these cells had been occupied regularly, mostly by individuals charged with minor offenses who would be released after posting bail or completing brief sentences for public intoxication or disturbing the peace. The cells were small but had been maintained with a cleanliness that reflected the building's overall commitment to dignity and order. Each cell contained a simple bench and a sink with running water, basic amenities that acknowledged the humanity of the people who waited there for their cases to be heard. The walls were painted in a neutral color that had been chosen to minimize the institutional feeling, though after decades of use, they had acquired the particular patina that came from thousands of hands, touching them during moments of anxiety and uncertainty. Thomas paused at cell 3, remembering a particular case from the courthouse's active years when Detective Maria Rodriguez had brought in a young man named David Kim who had been arrested for vandalism. David had spent 3 hours in this cell, not because his offense was particularly serious, but because Judge Foster had wanted to ensure that he understood the gravity of his actions before determining an appropriate consequence. The vandalism had involved spray painting graffiti on the side of the public library, defacing a mural that had been created by elementary school children as part of a community art project. Detective Rodriguez had approached the case with her characteristic thoroughness, not only identifying David as the perpetrator, but also investigating the circumstances that had led to his destructive behavior. David had been struggling with the recent divorce of his parents, acting out his anger and confusion through increasingly rebellious behavior that had culminated in the library incident. Judge Foster had taken the time to understand these underlying issues during David's court appearance, listening not only to the facts of the case, but also to David himself as he attempted to explain his actions and express his remorse. The resolution had been creative and restorative rather than simply punitive. Judge Foster had sentenced David to community service that involved helping to restore the mural he had damaged, working alongside the same elementary school children who had created the original artwork. The process had taken several weekends to complete, with David learning not only about the effort and creativity that had gone into the mural, but also about the impact that vandalism had on community, pride, and children's sense of security. Thomas remembered watching David during one of his community service sessions, seeing how the young man's initial reluctance had gradually transformed into genuine engagement with the project. The children had been initially wary of David, knowing that he was the one who had damaged their artwork, but they had eventually welcomed him as a helper and teacher, showing him techniques they had learned and asking for his assistance with difficult sections of the restoration. Moving through the courthouse, Thomas entered the law library where attorneys had once researched cases and prepared arguments for presentation before Judge Foster and her colleagues. The books remained on their shelves, thick volumes of legal precedents and statutes that had been consulted during the preparation of countless cases. Dust had settled on the leather bindings, creating a soft patina that spoke of the passage of time and the transition from this older model of legal research to the digital systems that characterized modern law practice. The library had been a place of quiet concentration during the courthouse's active years, with attorneys spending long hours reading through cases and legal opinions to find precedents that might support their clients' positions. Thomas remembered the soft sound of pages turning, the scratch of pens on legal pads, and the hushed conversations between lawyers and their assistants as they prepared for important hearings. One corner of the library had been particularly favored by public defender Patricia Wong, who had represented countless clients who could not afford private attorneys. Thomas had often seen her there during evening hours, working late to ensure that her clients received the same quality of representation that was available to those with greater financial resources. Her dedication had been legendary among courthouse staff, and Judge Foster had frequently commended her for the thoroughness and passion she brought to her work. Thomas recalled a particular case where Attorney Wong had spent weeks in this library, researching precedents for a young mother named Lisa Martinez, who had been charged with shoplifting baby formula and diapers. The case had seemed straightforward on its surface, but Attorney Wong had investigated the circumstances that had led to Lisa's desperate action, discovering that she was struggling to support her infant daughter while working 2 minimum wage jobs that still left her unable to afford basic necessities. The legal research had focused not on denying Lisa's guilt, which was clearly established by store security footage, but on identifying alternatives to traditional criminal penalties that might address both the crime and the underlying issues that had caused it. Attorney Wong had found precedents for diversionary programs that allowed first-time offenders to receive social services and support rather than criminal records that would make their already difficult situations even more challenging. Judge Foster had been receptive to Attorney Wong's arguments, recognizing that imprisoning Lisa or saddling her with a criminal record would only make it more difficult for her to provide for her daughter. The resolution had involved Lisa's participation in a job training program that led to better employment, combined with temporary assistance to ensure that she could meet her family's basic needs while completing the program. Courthouse's main corridor connected the various courtrooms and offices that had made up the building's judicial complex. During busy periods, this corridor had been filled with the quiet conversations of attorneys consulting with clients, families waiting for hearings to begin, and court officers managing the flow of people through the building's various proceedings. Now it stretched empty and silent, its high windows allowing moonlight to create geometric patterns on the polished floor. Thomas remembered the careful choreography that had characterized the courthouse's daily operations. Defendants arriving for hearings, attorneys moving between courtrooms to handle multiple cases, families gathering to support loved ones who were facing legal proceedings, and court reporters carrying their equipment from one courtroom to another as cases moved through their scheduled times. The building had been designed to accommodate these complex movements while maintaining the dignity and order that were essential to effective judicial proceedings. Wide corridors prevented crowding. Separate entrances allowed different groups to enter and exit without conflict. And waiting areas provided spaces where people could prepare for their court appearances without disrupting ongoing proceedings. Courtroom B had been used primarily for civil cases during Judge Patricia Davis's tenure, handling disputes between neighbors, contract disagreements, and small claims matters that required judicial resolution. The courtroom was smaller than Courtroom A, but had been arranged with the same attention to dignity and fairness that characterized the entire building. Thomas paused in the doorway of Courtroom B, remembering a particular case that Judge Davis had handled involving a property dispute between two longtime neighbors. Mrs. Helen Chun and Mr. Robert Torres had disagreed about the location of their property line, a dispute that had escalated over several months until both parties had sought legal resolution. The case had required Judge Davis to review property surveys, historical records, and witness testimony from other neighbors who had observed the disputed area over many years. Rather than simply ruling on the technical legal issues, Judge Davis had encouraged both parties to work together to find a solution that would preserve their neighborhood relationship while resolving the immediate dispute. Resolution had involved a compromise that gave each party partial satisfaction while also establishing clear guidelines for future maintenance of the disputed area. Mrs. Chun had gained clear title to a portion of the land she had been using for her garden, while Mr. Torres had received confirmation of his property rights in another section that he had been planning to develop. Most importantly, both neighbors had agreed to communicate directly about future property issues, rather than allowing misunderstandings to escalate into legal disputes. The courthouse's jury deliberation room had been the site of countless discussions where citizens had wrestled with complex questions of guilt and innocence, liability and damages, and the appropriate application of legal standards to human situations that rarely fit neatly into legal categories. The room contained a large table surrounded by chairs, creating an intimate space where 12 people could engage in the serious work of reaching consensus about difficult questions. Thomas remembered the weight of responsibility that jurors had carried during their deliberations, the careful way they had examined evidence and discussed their interpretations of witness testimony. Many jurors had approached their service with initial nervousness about their ability to make such important decisions, but most had found that the deliberation process itself provided the structure and support they needed to reach thoughtful conclusions. One particular case that had required extensive jury deliberation involved a young man named Michael Foster, who had been charged with assault following a fight outside a local bar. The incident had been witnessed by multiple people, but their accounts of what had happened differed significantly. creating challenges for the jury as they attempted to determine exactly what had occurred and whether Michael's actions constituted criminal assault or legitimate self-defense. The jury had spent 2 full days reviewing evidence and discussing the case, carefully examining witness testimony and physical evidence to understand the sequence of events that had led to the altercation. Their deliberations had been guided by Judge Foster's instructions about the legal standards that applied to self-defense claims. But the application of those standards to the specific facts of the case had required careful analysis and discussion. The final verdict had been not guilty, based on the jury's conclusion that Michael had been defending himself against an unprovoked attack rather than initiating violence. The decision had been difficult for some jurors, who struggled with the fact that someone had been seriously injured, regardless of who had been at fault. But they had ultimately concluded that the evidence supported Michael's account of the incident. Moving to the courthouse's administrative offices, Thomas encountered the spaces where court clerks had maintained the detailed records that documented every aspect of the judicial process. These offices had been centers of quiet efficiency, with clerks typing court orders, filing legal documents, and maintaining the calendars that ensured cases moved through the system in orderly fashion. The clerk's office had been managed by Mrs. Dorothy Martinez for over 20 years, and her attention to detail had been legendary among attorneys and judges who relied on accurate records and timely processing of legal documents. Thomas remembered her patient explanations to confused litigants who were navigating the court system for the first time, her willingness to stay late to ensure that important deadlines were met, and her institutional memory that helped resolve questions about cases that had been filed years earlier. One of Mrs. Martinez's most challenging responsibilities had been managing the courthouse's evidence storage area, where physical evidence from criminal cases was preserved until trials were completed and appeals were exhausted. The storage area was located in the courthouse basement, adjacent to the holding cells, and contained hundreds of boxes and envelopes containing items that had been crucial to various legal proceedings. Thomas descended to the basement level, where the evidence storage area remained locked and secure despite the courthouse's abandonment. The shelves contained boxes labeled with case numbers and dates, each one representing items that had once been central to someone's legal situation. Most of the evidence had been transferred to the new courthouse when this building was decommissioned, but some older cases remained here. Their evidence preserved in case appeals or other legal proceedings required access to the original materials. The evidence room had been a place of careful organization and meticulous record-keeping during the courthouse's active years. Every item that entered the room had been logged with detailed information about when it was received, who had submitted it, and which case it related to. Mrs. Martinez had maintained chain of custody documentation that ensured the integrity of evidence and prevented questions about tampering or contamination that might compromise legal proceedings. Thomas remembered the solemn atmosphere that had characterized the evidence room, the recognition that these ordinary objects had become important pieces in the puzzle of justice. A kitchen knife that had been used in an assault, photographs of a damaged vehicle from a traffic accident, or documents that proved fraud or forgery. Each item represented someone's attempt to establish truth in a legal proceeding. The courthouse's family court had occupied a separate section of the building, designed to handle the particularly sensitive cases involving divorce, child custody, and domestic relations. This area had been arranged to minimize the trauma and conflict that often accompanied family legal proceedings, with separate waiting areas and private consultation rooms where attorneys could meet with clients away from the stress of public corridors. Judge Linda Wilson had presided over family court for 15 years, handling cases that required not only legal expertise, but also sensitivity to the emotional complexity of family relationships. Her courtroom had been furnished with a more informal arrangement than the criminal courtrooms, creating an environment that encouraged honest Communication while maintaining the authority necessary for effective judicial proceedings. Thomas recalled a particular family court case that had required Judge Wilson's patient attention over several months. The Martinez family had been struggling with custody arrangements following a difficult divorce, with both parents genuinely concerned about their children's welfare, but unable to agree on visitation schedules and decision-making responsibilities. Judge Wilson had worked with family counselors and social workers to develop a custody arrangement that prioritized the children's needs while also recognizing both parents' rights and responsibilities. The process had been lengthy and sometimes emotionally difficult, but Judge Wilson had maintained focus on the long-term welfare of the children rather than the immediate desires of the competing adults. The resolution had required both parents to participate in co-parenting classes and to work with a family counselor to improve their communication about their children's needs. Judge Wilson had scheduled regular review hearings to monitor the arrangement and make adjustments as the children grew and their needs changed. Moving through the building's upper floors, Thomas encountered the chambers where judges had prepared for cases, reviewed legal briefs, and written the decisions that resolved disputes and determined consequences for criminal behavior. These private offices had been centers of careful deliberation, where judges had weighed evidence, considered legal precedents, and struggled with the complex task of applying abstract legal principles to concrete human situations. Judge Foster's chambers had been furnished with law books, family photographs, and the accumulated papers of a long judicial career. Thomas remembered the long hours she had spent in this office, reading case files and legal briefs, consulting with law clerks about complex legal questions, and writing the careful opinions that explained her decisions to the parties involved and to the broader legal community. The judicial chambers had been places of deep responsibility and sometimes lonely decision-making, where judges had confronted the weight of their authority to determine people's fates and resolve disputes that affected families, businesses, and communities. The work had required not only legal knowledge but also wisdom about human nature and the practical consequences of legal decisions. As Thomas completed his rounds through the abandoned courthouse, he reflected on the thousands of legal proceedings that had unfolded within these walls over the decades of the building's active service. Each case had represented someone's search for justice, whether they were victims seeking accountability, defendants hoping for fair treatment, or parties to civil disputes looking for resolution of their conflicts. The building itself had been designed to support these human dramas, while maintaining the dignity and order that were essential to effective legal proceedings. From the holding cells where defendants had waited for their hearings to the jury room where citizens had deliberated about complex questions of justice, every space had been arranged to serve the careful process of applying legal principles to human situations. The empty corridors and darkened courtrooms now held only memories of these proceedings, but Thomas found comfort in the knowledge that the work of justice continued in the new courthouse across town. The judges, attorneys, clerks, and other court personnel who had once worked in this building had carried their experience and wisdom to the new facility, ensuring continuity in the essential work of maintaining legal order and protecting individual rights. The old courthouse stood as a monument to the enduring importance of institutions that provided peaceful means for resolving disputes and addressing criminal behavior. In the quiet dignity of its empty spaces, the building continued to represent the community's commitment to justice and the rule of law, even as the practical work of the courts had moved to newer facilities designed for contemporary needs. As dawn approached and Thomas prepared to complete his shift, he felt a deep appreciation for the role that buildings like this courthouse had played in maintaining social order and protecting individual rights. The marble floors and wooden panels would continue to age gracefully, holding their memories of the countless human dramas that had unfolded within these walls, serving as reminders of the ongoing importance of institutions dedicated to justice and the peaceful resolution of human conflicts. The Riverside neighborhood had always been the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. Names and children played safely in tree-lined streets that seemed removed from the harsher realities of urban life. Detective Susan Williams had been assigned to this district for 8 years, long enough to watch families grow and change, to see children graduate from high school and elderly residents celebrate milestone anniversaries in homes they had occupied for decades. On this particular autumn morning, Detective Williams walked slowly through the familiar streets, noting the small changes that marked the passage of seasons and years. Mrs. Chun's garden had been prepared for winter, the last of her chrysanthemums, creating splashes of gold and burgundy against the neat white fence that surrounded her property. The Morrison family had painted their front porch, choosing a soft blue that complemented the century-old maple tree that dominated their small front yard. These were the details that Detective Williams had learned to notice during her years of community policing, the small indicators of how families invested in their neighborhood and maintained the sense of stability that made Riverside such a desirable place to live. But she also knew that beneath this surface of domestic tranquility, ordinary people sometimes found themselves touched by circumstances that required police intervention and the careful work of community healing. The call had come in 3 days earlier, a report of domestic disturbance at the home of Maria and Carlos Gonzalez, a young couple who had moved to Riverside 2 years ago when Carlos found work at the downtown accounting firm. Neighbors had heard raised voices and what sounded like furniture being moved forcefully, enough to cause concern, but not immediate alarm from people who understood that every marriage faced occasional stress and conflict. Detective Williams had responded to the call with the patience that characterized her approach to family situations. She knew that domestic disputes required careful assessment to determine whether intervention was necessary and what form that intervention should take. Many arguments between spouses were private matters that resolved themselves without outside assistance, but some situations escalated in ways that threatened safety and required professional support. Her initial visit to the Gonzalez home had revealed a young couple struggling with financial pressures that had strained their relationship beyond their ability to manage independently. Carlos had been working longer hours to qualify for a promotion that would provide better financial security, while Maria had been caring for her elderly mother who had moved in with them after suffering a stroke 6 months earlier. The argument that neighbors had overheard had erupted when Carlos expressed frustration about the changes in their household routine, while Maria had responded with anger about his apparent lack of understanding regarding her mother's needs. Both were fundamentally caring people who had found themselves overwhelmed by circumstances that neither had anticipated when they first married. Detective Williams had spent considerable time with both Maria and Carlos, listening to their concerns and helping them understand how external pressures were affecting their relationship. Rather than treating the situation as a simple matter of law enforcement, she had approached it as a family crisis that required support and resources rather than criminal penalties. The resolution had involved connecting the Gonzalez family with community resources that could address their specific challenges. Maria's mother had been enrolled in a day program for stroke survivors, providing her with social stimulation and therapeutic activities, while giving Maria several hours each day to manage household responsibilities and maintain her own emotional well-being. Carlos had been connected with family counseling services that helped him understand the emotional impact of his mother-in-law's condition on his wife, while also providing him with strategies for managing work stress that didn't spill over into his family relationships. The couple had learned communication techniques that allowed them to discuss their challenges without the arguments escalating into the kind of conflict that had originally brought them to police attention. Detective Williams had maintained contact with the Gonzalez family over the following months, checking in periodically to ensure that the support services were meeting their needs and that the family situation remained stable. Her follow-up visits had revealed a household that had found its new equilibrium. with Carlos and Maria working together to manage their complex responsibilities while maintaining the loving relationship that had brought them together. Moving through the neighborhood, Detective Williams paused at the home of the Morrison family, where she had recently completed an investigation that had required delicate handling of generational conflicts within an extended family. The situation had involved allegations that teenage grandson Kevin Morrison had been stealing money from his grandmother's purse during his regular visits to help with household chores and errands that Mrs. Dorothy Morrison had been reluctant to contact police about the suspected thefts, torn between her concerns about the missing money and her love for Kevin, who had been a source of joy and practical assistance since his grandfather's death 2 years earlier. The initial report had been filed by Kevin's aunt, Patricia Morrison, who had noticed the pattern of missing money during her own visits to help care for her elderly mother. Detective Williams had approached the investigation with sensitivity to the complex family dynamics involved. Accusations of theft within families created emotional damage that could persist long after the immediate issues were resolved, and she had been careful to gather information without unnecessarily damaging relationships between family members, who would need to continue supporting each other regardless of the investigation's outcome. Asterisk, the investigation had revealed that Kevin had been taking small amounts of money to contribute to his family's household expenses, which had increased significantly when his father was laid off from his job at the manufacturing plant. Rather than asking for help directly, Kevin had convinced himself that taking money from his grandmother was justified because he was providing her with valuable services and because his family's needs were urgent. Detective Williams had worked with the entire Morrison family to address both the immediate issue of the stolen money and the underlying problems that had contributed to Kevin's poor decision. The resolution had involved Kevin making restitution through additional chores and yard work, while also establishing better communication within the family about financial difficulties and the resources available to address them. The case had concluded with the family developing a formal agreement about Kevin's responsibilities and compensation for helping his grandmother, creating clear expectations that prevented future misunderstandings while preserving the valuable relationship between grandmother and grandson. Mrs. Morrison had expressed gratitude for Detective Williams's sensitive handling of the situation, noting that the investigation had ultimately strengthened family bonds rather than damaging them. Detective Williams continued her walk through the neighborhood, passing the elementary school where she had recently worked with administrators to address a situation involving playground bullying that had escalated to the point where parents were considering involving law enforcement. The situation had involved a group of fifth-grade students who had been systematically excluding and harassing a classmate whose family had recently immigrated from Somalia. The bullying had included name-calling, exclusion from games and social activities, and occasional pushing or shoving that had left the targeted student, Amira Hassan, afraid to attend school and reluctant to participate in playground activities. Her parents had initially tried to address the situation through conversations with teachers and school administrators, but the harassment had continued despite these interventions. Detective Williams had been called to the school when the bullying escalated to an incident where Amira's backpack was thrown into a muddy area of the playground, damaging her books and homework assignments. While the incident might not have constituted criminal behavior, the pattern of harassment had reached a level that required coordinated intervention to protect Amira's right to a safe educational environment. Asterisk, working with school counselors and administrators, Detective Williams had developed a comprehensive approach to addressing the bullying that included both consequences for the students involved and educational programming designed to promote understanding and acceptance of cultural diversity. The resolution had focused on helping all students understand the impact of their behavior while also building stronger connections between families from different cultural backgrounds. The intervention had included a series of classroom presentations about immigration and cultural diversity, with Amira's family sharing their experiences and traditions with students who had previously seen their differences as reasons for exclusion. The bullying students had been required to participate in community service projects that brought them into contact with diverse populations, helping them develop empathy and understanding that prevented future incidents. Detective Williams had followed up with regular visits to the school, monitoring the situation to ensure that the interventions were effective and that Amira felt safe and supported in her educational environment. Her reports documented not only the resolution of the immediate bullying situation, but also the broader positive changes in school climate that had resulted from the diversity education programming. The neighborhood library had been the site of another recent case that had required Detective Williams's attention, involving allegations that someone was regularly stealing books and selling them online for profit. The thefts had been discovered when librarians noticed that recently acquired books were disappearing from the shelves, faster than normal circulation patterns would explain. The investigation had revealed that Marcus Chun, a college student who frequently used the library for studying, had been taking books that he thought would be valuable in the used book market. Rather than checking them out through normal procedures, he had been concealing the books in his backpack and leaving the library without going through the checkout process. Detective Williams had approached Marcus's case with understanding of the financial pressures facing college students, recognizing that his theft was motivated by economic desperation rather than criminal intent. Her investigation had revealed that Marcus was working 2 part-time jobs while attending school full-time, struggling to pay tuition and living expenses without family financial support. The resolution had involved Marcus making restitution for the stolen books while also connecting him with financial aid resources and work study opportunities that could address his economic needs through legitimate means. The library had agreed to hire Marcus as a part-time assistant, allowing him to earn money while also contributing positively to the institution he had previously victimized. The case had concluded with Marcus becoming an advocate for student financial literacy, sharing his experience with other students who might be tempted to make similar poor decisions when facing economic pressure. His transformation from library thief to library employee had demonstrated the potential for restorative justice approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. Detective Williams paused at the corner park where families gathered on weekend afternoons, remembering a recent case that had involved the theft of playground equipment that had been purchased through community fundraising efforts. The stolen items included a small climbing structure and several pieces of safety equipment that had been installed through volunteer labor coordinated by the neighborhood association. The investigation had revealed that the theft was connected to a broader pattern of metal theft in the area, with criminals targeting copper pipes, aluminum siding, and other materials that could be sold to scrap metal dealers. The playground equipment had been taken not because of its function, but because of the resale value of its metal components. Detective Williams had worked with scrap metal dealers throughout the region to identify the stolen playground equipment and trace it back to the individuals responsible for the theft. The investigation had required patience and coordination with multiple businesses, but had eventually led to the arrest of 3 individuals who had been systematically stealing metal materials from residential and commercial properties. The resolution had involved not only criminal charges for the thieves, but also the return and reinstallation of the stolen playground equipment. The community had rallied around the project, with volunteers contributing additional labor and materials to improve the playground beyond its original condition. The incident had ultimately strengthened neighborhood bonds and demonstrated the resilience of communities when faced with criminal victimization. Walking past the senior center where she had recently completed an investigation involving financial fraud targeting elderly residents, Detective Williams reflected on the particular challenges of protecting vulnerable populations from criminal exploitation. The case had involved a telephone scam where criminals posed as grandchildren in financial emergencies. convincing elderly victims to wire money for supposedly urgent needs. Mrs. Helen Wong had been targeted by this scam, receiving a call from someone claiming to be her grandson David, supposedly calling from jail after being arrested while traveling. The caller had provided enough personal information to seem credible and had created a sense of urgency that prevented Mrs. Wong from taking time to verify the story through normal family communication channels. Detective Williams had been contacted when Mrs. Wong's actual grandson visited her the following day and learned about the money transfer. The investigation had revealed that the scammers had gathered personal information through social media research and public records, creating convincing narratives that exploited elderly victims' love for their grandchildren and their desire to help family members in crisis. The resolution had involved coordination with federal law enforcement agencies that had jurisdiction over the interstate wire fraud, while also implementing local education programs to help elderly residents recognize and avoid similar scams. Detective Williams had worked with senior center staff to develop presentations about financial fraud, teaching elderly residents about common scam techniques and strategies for verifying suspicious requests for money. The education program had included role-playing exercises where seniors practiced responding to suspicious phone calls, building confidence in their ability to resist high-pressure tactics that scammers use to create false urgency. Detective Williams had also helped establish communication protocols within families, ensuring that elderly relatives had multiple ways to verify emergencies before responding to requests for financial assistance. The neighborhood small business district had been the location of another recent investigation involving a series of break-ins at shops and restaurants that had created concerns about the area's safety and economic viability. The break-ins had followed a consistent pattern, with thieves targeting cash registers and small electronics, while avoiding merchandise that would be difficult to transport or sell quickly. Detective Williams had worked with business owners to identify security vulnerabilities and implement improvements that could prevent future break-ins. The investigation had revealed that the thefts were being committed by teenagers who lived in a nearby apartment complex and who had been targeting businesses during late-night hours when the area was largely deserted. The arrest of the teenage thieves had led to a broader conversation about youth engagement and economic opportunities in the neighborhood. Detective Williams had worked with community leaders to develop after-school and summer employment programs that provided positive alternatives to criminal behavior, while also addressing the underlying economic conditions that had contributed to the thefts. The resolution had included restitution from the teenage offenders and their families, but had also resulted in several of the young people finding legitimate employment with the same businesses they had previously victimized. The business owners had been initially reluctant to hire individuals who had stolen from them, but had eventually recognized the value of providing second chances to young people who demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to change. As Detective Williams completed her walk through the neighborhood, she reflected on the complex web of relationships and circumstances that characterized community life in Riverside. Each case she handled was connected to broader patterns of family stress, economic pressure, cultural conflict, and social change that required understanding and intervention rather than simple law enforcement responses. The families she worked with were fundamentally good people who sometimes found themselves in situations that exceeded their ability to cope independently. Her role as a community police officer was to provide not only law enforcement services but also connections to resources and support systems that could address underlying problems and prevent future criminal behavior. The neighborhood remained peaceful in its surface appearance, with well-maintained homes and gardens that reflected residents' investment in their community. But Detective Williams knew that this appearance of tranquility was maintained through the ongoing work of families, schools, community organizations, and law enforcement agencies that worked together to address challenges before they escalated into serious problems. The stories she carried with her from each case were testimonies to the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Families like the Gonzalez household had found ways to strengthen their relationships while managing complex caregiving responsibilities. Young people like Kevin Morrison and Marcus Chun had learned from their mistakes and become contributing members of their communities. Elderly residents like Mrs. Wong and Mrs. Morrison had received protection and support while maintaining their independence and dignity. In the gentle rhythm of neighborhood life, Detective Williams found evidence of the ongoing human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and mutual support. The crimes she investigated were often symptoms of larger social issues, but they were also opportunities for individuals and families to receive help, learn new skills, and build stronger connections with their communities. The sun was setting over Riverside as Detective Williams returned to her patrol car, ready to respond to whatever new challenges the evening might bring. The neighborhood settled into its nighttime quiet, families gathering for dinner and children completing homework assignments. The ordinary activities of domestic life continuing their eternal cycle of growth, challenge, and renewal. In the peaceful streets of Riverside, the work of community policing continued its patient mission of maintaining safety while preserving the human connections that made neighborhood life possible. Detective Williams carried with her the knowledge that every call she answered was an opportunity to strengthen these connections, to help families navigate difficulties, and to contribute to the ongoing work of building communities where people could live with dignity and hope. The night shift at the 5th Precinct began at 11 p.m. when the day's bustle gradually gave way to the quieter rhythms that characterized police work during the sleeping hours. Sergeant Patricia Wong had been working nights for 12 years, long enough to appreciate the particular qualities that distinguished evening patrol from the more hectic pace of daytime law enforcement. The city took on a different character after dark, revealing aspects of community life that were hidden during the busy daylight hours. The precinct building itself seemed to settle into a more contemplative mood as the night progressed. The main desk area, which buzzed with activity during day shifts, became a place of subdued conversation and gentle efficiency. Officer Michael Torres staffed the front desk tonight, handling the telephone calls and walk-in visitors who sought police assistance during the overnight hours. His voice carried the calm authority that came from years of experience in helping people navigate crisis situations during the vulnerable hours when most social services were unavailable. The duty roster for tonight included 6 patrol officers covering the precinct's territory, each assigned to specific neighborhoods where they maintained regular contact with residents and business owners who had learned to recognize their patrol cars and appreciate their consistent presence. These officers had developed deep familiarity with their assigned areas, knowing which streets required extra attention and which families might need occasional check-ins during difficult periods. Officer Linda Chun patrolled the Riverside district, where she had been assigned for 3 years and had developed relationships with residents that extended beyond traditional law enforcement interactions. Her patrol car moved slowly through tree-lined streets where porch lights created pools of warm illumination and bedroom windows glowed softly behind drawn curtains. Most families were settling into their evening routines, but Officer Chun's presence provided reassurance for those who valued the security that came from visible police protection. Tonight's first call had come from Mrs. Dorothy Morrison, an elderly widow who lived alone in a 2-story house that had been her home for 47 years. Mrs. Morrison had reported hearing sounds in her backyard that suggested someone might be attempting to break into her garden shed where she stored lawn equipment and holiday decorations. Officer Chun had responded within minutes, her approach careful and quiet to avoid alerting any potential intruder who might still be in the mueza. area, the investigation had revealed that the sounds Mrs. Morrison had heard were caused by raccoons that had discovered a bag of bird seed stored in the shed and had been working persistently to access this unexpected food source. Officer Chun had helped Mrs. Morrison secure the birdseed in a metal container that would resist wildlife intrusion, while also checking the shed's lock and recommending improvements that would provide better security for the stored equipment. The call had concluded with Officer Chun sharing information about wildlife management with Mrs. Morrison, explaining how urban raccoons had adapted to suburban environments and offering practical suggestions for preventing future incidents. Mrs. Morrison had expressed gratitude, not only for the immediate assistance, but also for the patient way Officer Chun had addressed her concerns, without making her feel foolish for calling about what had turned out to be a simple animal problem. This type of call was typical of night shift work, where officers often addressed concerns that reflected the heightened awareness that came with darkness and solitude. People noticed sounds and movements after dark that they might ignore during busy daylight hours, and part of the night officer's role was to provide reassurance, while also remaining alert to genuine security threats that might be hidden among more innocent explanations. Officer David Martinez patrolled the downtown business district, where his responsibilities included checking the security of shops and restaurants that had closed for the evening. His route took him past the familiar storefronts that defined the city's commercial center, from the family-owned bakery that had operated in the same location for 3 generations to the modern electronics store that had opened just 6 months earlier. Tonight's patrol had revealed an open door at Peterson's hardware store, a family business that had been serving the community for over 50 years. Officer Martinez had found that the door had been left unlocked when the store closed, probably the result of the owner's distraction during the busy end-of-day routine rather than any criminal activity. Following department protocol, he had secured the building and contacted Mr. Peterson at home to inform him of the situation. Mr. Peterson had arrived at the store within 20 minutes. Grateful for Officer Martinez's vigilance and relieved to discover that nothing had been disturbed inside the building, the 2 men had conducted a thorough walkthrough to ensure that all cash registers were secure and that no merchandise had been taken. Finding everything exactly as it should have been, except for the unlocked door, the incident had provided an opportunity for Officer Martinez to discuss security procedures with Mr. Peterson, reviewing the store's closing checklist and suggesting small improvements that could prevent future oversights. Their conversation had taken place in the quiet store, surrounded by the tools and supplies that served the community's practical needs. 2 men sharing the responsibility of protecting local businesses from the vulnerabilities that came with urban commerce. These routine security checks formed an important part of night patrol duties, providing business owners with confidence that their establishments were being monitored during the hours when they were most vulnerable to burglary and vandalism. The relationship between patrol officers and local business owners was built on mutual trust and consistent attention to the small details that prevented larger problems. Officer Rebecca Johnson covered the residential area near the community college, where her patrol route included both family neighborhoods and student housing complexes that served the institution's diverse population. The area was generally quiet during evening hours, with most students focused on studying or working part-time jobs that helped them manage the costs of their education. Tonight she had received a noise complaint from residents of Maple Street who were concerned about music and voices coming from a student rental house that had been the source of occasional disturbances over the past semester. Officer Johnson had approached the situation with the diplomatic skills that were essential for managing conflicts between permanent residents and the transient student population. Her Conversation with the students had revealed that they were hosting a small study group that had evolved into a social gathering as the evening progressed. The students had been unaware that their voices were carrying to neighboring houses and had been cooperative about reducing noise levels when Officer Johnson explained the concerns that had prompted the complaint. The resolution had involved establishing clear expectations about acceptable noise levels during evening hours, with the students agreeing to move their social activities indoors and to be more mindful of their neighbors' need for quiet during weeknight hours. Officer Johnson had also spoken with the complaining neighbors, encouraging them to communicate directly with the students about future concerns before involving police. Asterisk. This type of community mediation was a regular feature of night shift work, particularly in areas where different populations lived in close proximity. Officer Johnson's approach emphasized education and communication rather than enforcement, recognizing that most noise problems resulted from thoughtlessness rather than deliberate disrespect for community standards. Precinct's Communications Center maintained contact with all patrol units throughout the night, coordinating responses to calls and ensuring that officers remained safe during their solitary patrols through quiet neighborhoods. Dispatcher Maria Santos had been working nights for 8 years, developing the particular skills needed to assess emergency calls and deploy resources effectively during the hours when backup might be further away and response times were more critical. Tonight's dispatch log showed the typical pattern of night shift calls, security checks, noise complaints, domestic disturbances that required careful assessment, and occasional medical emergencies where police provided assistance to paramedic crews. Each call was logged with precise timing and detailed notes that documented the nature of the incident and the actions taken by responding officers. Dispatcher Santos maintained radio contact with patrol units throughout her shift, providing updates about developing situations and coordinating responses that required multiple officers. Her calm voice provided reassurance to officers working alone in their patrol areas, while her detailed knowledge of each district helped her deploy resources efficiently when emergency situations developed. The radio traffic tonight had been light, reflecting the generally peaceful nature of the community during overnight hours. Most communication consisted of routine check-ins and status updates as officers completed their assigned patrols and security checks. The steady rhythm of radio calls created a kind of electronic heartbeat that connected all the officers working throughout the city's various neighborhoods. Officer Robert Kim patrolled the industrial district where warehouses and manufacturing facilities operated around the clock, providing employment for workers whose schedules differed from the typical 9-to-5 pattern. His responsibilities included monitoring these facilities for security issues while also maintaining contact with the workers who comprised the night shift community in this part of the city. Tonight he had stopped at Morrison Manufacturing, where security guard Helen Torres was completing her rounds of the facility that produced automotive parts for assembly plants throughout the region. Officer Kim's regular visits provided an additional layer of security, while also offering social contact for workers who spent long hours in relative isolation during their night shifts. The conversation between Officer Kim and Ms. Torres had covered routine security matters, as well as broader community issues that affected the industrial district. Recent changes in shipping schedules had resulted in more truck traffic during overnight hours, creating noise concerns for residents of nearby neighborhoods. Officer Kim had been working with transportation companies and community leaders to address these issues while balancing the economic needs of local businesses. These industrial patrols represented an important but often overlooked aspect of community policing, ensuring that workers who kept essential services operating during night hours received the same level of police protection and community attention as residents of more visible neighborhoods. Officer Kim's presence demonstrated the department's commitment to serving all segments of the community, regardless of their work schedules or economic circumstances. The night shift also included regular patrols of public facilities that served important community functions during daytime hours, but required security monitoring when they were close to the public. Officer Sarah Williams had responsibility for checking the community center, public library, and elementary schools that served the city's families during their regular operating hours. Her patrol of Lincoln Elementary School had revealed that someone had left playground equipment scattered around the schoolyard. Probably children who had been playing after school hours and had forgotten to return balls and jump ropes to their proper storage locations. Officer Williams had taken the time to collect and secure the equipment, ensuring that it would be available for use during the next school day. These small acts of community caretaking represented an important but often unrecognized aspect of police work, where officers contributed to the maintenance of public spaces and community resources that served residents' daily needs. Officer Williams understood that children's access to safe playground equipment was connected to larger questions of community welfare and quality of life. Her school patrol also included checking the security of building entrances and ensuring that no vandalism or unauthorized access had occurred during the hours when the buildings were unoccupied. The partnership between police and school administrators was built on shared recognition that educational facilities were community resources that deserved protection and care from all residents. As the night progressed toward the early morning hours, the character of patrol work shifted gradually toward preparation for the transition to day shift operations. Officers completed their paperwork from the evening's calls, updated their supervisors about ongoing situations that would require follow-up, and prepared the detailed reports that documented their activities for review by administrators and community leaders. Sergeant Wong made her rounds to each patrol area, checking with officers about their evening's activities and ensuring that all calls had been properly documented and resolved. Her supervisory role included not only administrative oversight, but also professional support for officers who worked in relative isolation during the long night hours. The conversation between Sergeant Wong and Officer Chun had included discussion of the raccoon incident at Mrs. Morrison's house, with both officers recognizing the importance of treating elderly residents, concerns with respect and patience even when the problems turned out to be minor. Their discussion reflected the department's philosophy that community policing required attention to all residents' needs, regardless of the apparent significance of their concerns. These supervisory conversations also provided opportunities for officers to discuss challenging situations and receive guidance about handling complex cases that might develop over multiple shifts. Sergeant Wong's experience and perspective helped individual officers understand how their work fit into larger patterns of community safety and crime prevention. The precinct's night shift concluded with the gradual arrival of day shift officers, who would take over responsibility for community safety during the busy daylight hours. The transition involved detailed briefings where night shift officers shared information about ongoing investigations, community concerns that required follow-up, and security issues that day shift personnel should monitor. Officer Torres provided a comprehensive summary of his evening's activities to his day shift counterpart, including details about the hardware store security check, the noise complaint resolution, and routine patrol observations that might be relevant to daytime operations. This transfer of information ensured continuity of service and demonstrated the collaborative nature of police work across different shifts and assignments. The night shift had maintained the quiet vigilance that allowed families to sleep peacefully in their homes, students to focus on their studies, and business owners to trust that their establishments were protected during vulnerable overnight hours. Each officer had contributed to this collective effort through patient attention to routine duties and respectful response to community members who sought police assistance. As dawn approached and the city began to stir with the first signs of morning activity, The night shift officers completed their paperwork and prepared to return to their own homes and families. Their work had been largely invisible to the sleeping community, but their presence had provided the security and stability that made peaceful rest possible for thousands of residents. The steady rhythm of night patrol continued its ancient pattern of protection and service, with each shift building on the work of previous shifts to maintain the delicate balance of community safety and individual freedom that characterized civilized society. In the gentle conclusion of another night's work, these officers found satisfaction in knowing that they had contributed to the ongoing mission of keeping their community safe and peaceful. The evidence storage room in the basement of the central precinct had accumulated decades of photographs, each one representing a moment when someone's life had intersected with the machinery of justice. Archivist Elena Martinez moved slowly through the organized rows of filing cabinets, her white cotton gloves protecting the fragile images from the oils and acids that human touch could impart to aging photographic paper. The work required patience and reverence, handling these visual documents that had once been crucial pieces of evidence, but now served as historical records of how the community had navigated conflict and crisis over the years. The photographs were organized chronologically and by case type, creating a visual timeline of the city's evolution through the lens of police work. Images from the 1950s were mounted on heavy cardstock and had acquired the sepia tones that came with age, while more recent photographs retained their original colors but showed the particular quality of film processing that had been standard before digital photography. Transformed police documentation. Elena paused at a cabinet containing photographs from a 1967 case involving vandalism at the newly constructed community center. The images showed spray-painted graffiti on exterior walls that had been damaged during the facility's first month of operation. Looking at these photographs 57 years later, Elena could see past the immediate damage to appreciate the architectural details of a building that had been designed to serve multiple generations of community members. The case file accompanying the photographs told the story of how Detective William Chun had approached the vandalism investigation with patience and community engagement rather than simply pursuing criminal charges. The graffiti had been created by a group of teenagers who felt excluded from the programming at the new community center, which had been planned primarily by adults without significant input from the young people it was intended to serve. Detective Chun's investigation had revealed that the vandalism was an expression of frustration rather than malicious destruction. The teenagers had wanted to participate in the center's activities, but had felt that the programming was designed for younger children or adult learners, leaving few options for adolescents who were seeking constructive ways to spend their after-school and weekend hours. Elena examined photographs of the community center's interior, taken during Detective Chun's meetings with the teenagers and center staff to develop programming that would address the concerns that had led to the vandalism. The images showed young people working alongside adults to design art programs, sports leagues, and social activities that would engage teenagers while also contributing positively to the broader community. Resolution of the case had involved the teenage vandals becoming some of the community center's most dedicated volunteers, helping to establish programs that served their age group while also making restitution for the damage they had caused. Photographs from several months after the initial incident showed the same exterior walls, now featuring murals created through collaboration between the teenagers and local artists who had been recruited to guide the center's visual arts programming. Moving to another cabinet, Elena found photographs from a 1973 case involving a series of burglaries in the Riverside neighborhood. The images documented crime scenes with the methodical precision that characterized police photography, showing points of entry, disturbed household items, and evidence that had been crucial to identifying and prosecuting the perpetrators. But looking at these photographs decades later, Elena found herself drawn to the incidental details that revealed how families had lived during that era. Interior shots taken for evidence purposes also captured wallpaper patterns, furniture styles, and household objects that painted a picture of domestic life in the 1970s. A photograph taken in Mrs. Helen Wong's living room to document a broken window also showed her collection of family photographs arranged on a side table, creating an unintentional portrait of multiple generations, gathered for holiday celebrations and milestone events. The burglary case had been solved when Detective Patricia Davis identified a pattern in the items being stolen and the methods used to enter homes. The photographs showed that the burglar had consistently targeted small, valuable items that could be easily carried and quickly sold, while avoiding larger electronics that would be difficult to transport and more easily traced through serial numbers. Elena examined photographs of the recovered stolen items, arranged on tables in the police station's evidence room. The images showed jewelry, small electronics, and collectibles that represented not just monetary value, but also sentimental significance to the families who had been victimized. Each item had been carefully cataloged and photographed to document its condition and assist in returning it to its rightful owner. The case file included photographs of the arrest of Robert Morrison, a 23-year-old unemployed factory worker who had turned to burglary when he was unable to find legitimate employment after being laid off from the steel plant. The arrest photograph showed a young man who appeared more desperate than dangerous, someone who had made poor choices during a difficult period, rather than someone committed to a criminal lifestyle. Detective Davis had worked with Morrison's family and social service agencies to address the underlying issues that had led to his criminal behavior. Photographs from several months after his arrest showed Morrison participating in a job training program that had been established to help displaced factory workers develop new skills for employment in the changing economy. Elena moved to a section containing photographs from family court cases, where images had been used to document custody disputes, domestic violence situations, and other family crises that required judicial intervention. These photographs were often more emotionally challenging than criminal evidence, showing children and families during some of their most vulnerable moments. One case from 1981 had involved custody arrangements for the Martinez children following their parents' divorce. The photograph showed the family's home as it had been divided between two parents who were struggling to create separate living arrangements while maintaining stability for their 3 children. Images of the children's bedrooms, play areas, and school supplies documented the practical details that family court judges needed to make decisions about custody and visitation rights. The case had been handled by Judge Linda Wilson, who had focused on the children's needs rather than the parents' conflicts when determining custody arrangements. Photographs from follow-up visits showed how the family had adapted to their new circumstances, with both parents working together to ensure that the children maintained strong relationships with both sides of their extended family. Elena found these family court photographs particularly moving because they captured moments of transition and adaptation that most families managed privately. The children in the images had grown into adults during the decades since these photographs were taken, probably with little memory of the legal proceedings that had shaped their childhood living arrangements. Moving to more recent photographs, Elena examined images from a 1995 case involving identity theft that had affected several elderly residents in the Sunset District. The photographs documented the paper trail that Detective Michael Torres had assembled to trace the crime back to its source, showing bank statements, credit card applications, and other documents that had been forged using stolen personal information. The images revealed the meticulous work that had been required to build a case against the identity thief. with each document photographed to preserve evidence while also protecting the privacy of the victims. Detective Torres had worked with financial institutions and government agencies to understand how personal information was being obtained and misused, developing investigative techniques that had become standard practice for handling identity theft cases. Elena examined photographs of the arrest of Margaret Kim, a 41-year-old home health aide who had been using her access to elderly clients' homes to steal personal documents and financial information. The arrest photograph showed a woman who had appeared shocked by her apprehension, suggesting that she had believed her crimes would continue undetected. The case file included photographs documenting the extensive impact of Kim's crimes on her elderly victims, showing how identity theft had affected their credit ratings, bank accounts, and ability to access financial services. Detective Torres had worked with each victim individually to help them restore their financial standing and protect themselves from future victimization. The resolution of the case had included not only criminal prosecution, but also civil restitution that helped victims recover their financial losses. Photographs from victim impact hearings showed elderly residents testifying about how the identity theft had affected their lives, providing human faces for crimes that were often treated as merely financial abstractions. Elena found photographs from a 2003 case involving vandalism at Lincoln High School, where someone had been damaging computer equipment in the library and computer labs. The images showed the systematic nature of the damage, with keyboards destroyed, monitors scratched, and cables cut in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than random destruction. The investigation had been conducted by Detective Sarah Williams, who had approached the case by examining not just the physical evidence, but also the social dynamics within the school that might have motivated someone to target educational technology. Her photographs documented not only the damaged equipment, but also the broader context of the school's technology programs and the students who relied on computer access for their educational advancement. Case had been solved when Detective Williams identified Jason Chun, a 17-year-old student who had been frustrated by his inability to access computer time due to high demand and limited resources. Rather than simply prosecuting Jason for vandalism, Detective Williams had worked with school administrators to address the underlying resource allocation issues that had contributed to his destructive behavior. Photographs from the resolution of the case showed Jason working with technology staff to repair the damaged equipment while also helping to establish a reservation system that provided more equitable access to computer resources. The images captured a young person learning both technical skills and personal responsibility through a restorative justice approach that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Moving through the archives, Elena encountered photographs from countless cases where ordinary people had found themselves involved in legal proceedings that documented both their worst moments and their capacity for growth and redemption. Each image represented someone's intersection with the justice system, but viewed collectively, they painted a picture of a community's ongoing effort to balance accountability with compassion. The photographic archive included images of crime scenes, evidence, arrests, and court proceedings, but also documented the human side of police work that was often invisible to the broader public. Photographs showed officers teaching safety classes at elementary schools, participating in community events, and working with families to address problems before they escalated into criminal matters. Elena paused at a photograph from 1989 showing Officer Robert Kim reading to children at the public library during a community outreach event. The image captured the officer's genuine engagement with the children, who were seated around him in a circle, listening intently to a story about friendship and cooperation. The photograph had been taken for the police department's annual report, but it represented the broader philosophy of community policing that emphasized building relationships rather than simply enforcing laws. Another photograph from the same era showed Detective Patricia Wong working with teenagers to establish a youth advisory council that provided input on police, policies, and procedures affecting young people. The image showed adults and teenagers sitting around a conference table, engaged in serious discussion about issues that affected their community. The formal setting of the meeting was balanced by the relaxed body language of participants who had developed mutual respect and understanding. These community engagement photographs documented a different aspect of police work than the crime scene images that dominated the archives. They showed officers as educators, mentors, and community partners rather than simply law enforcement professionals. Elena understood that these images were equally important to preserving the complete history of how police work had evolved to meet community needs. The evidence room also contained photographs that had been submitted by community members as part of various investigations, showing neighborhoods, businesses, and public spaces from the perspectives of residents who had observed suspicious activities or safety concerns. These citizen-submitted photographs often revealed details that official police documentation might have missed, providing valuable context for understanding how crimes affected community life. Elena examined a series of photographs submitted by Mrs. Dorothy Torres during a 2001 investigation into drug dealing in her neighborhood. The images showed the same street corner at different times of day, documenting patterns of activity that had concerned longtime residents but might not have been obvious to outside observers. Mrs. Torres had carefully photographed license plates, clothing descriptions, and behavioral patterns that had ultimately helped police identify and arrest individuals involved in illegal drug sales. The photographs had been taken with a simple camera but demonstrated Mrs. Torres's careful observation and documentation skills. Her images had provided crucial evidence while also showing her commitment to protecting her neighborhood's safety and quality of life. The case file included a thank you letter from the police department acknowledging her courage and civic responsibility. As Elena continued her archival work, she found photographs that documented the changing technology and procedures that had characterized police work over the decades. Images from the 1960s showed officers using large, bulky cameras with flash attachments, while more recent photographs demonstrated the evolution toward digital imaging and computerized evidence management systems. The technological changes reflected broader social and economic changes that had affected both police work and community life. Elena could trace the city's development through background details and crime scene photographs. Seeing how neighborhoods had evolved, businesses had changed, and architectural styles had reflected different eras of prosperity and challenge. The photographic archive represented more than just law enforcement documentation. It was a visual history of how a community had navigated the challenges of maintaining safety and justice while adapting to changing social and economic conditions. Each photograph was a window into a particular moment when someone's life had intersected with the institutions designed to protect and serve the broader community. Elena carefully returned the last batch of photographs to their protective storage, ensuring that these visual records would be preserved for future researchers and community members who might need to understand how their city had addressed crime and conflict over the decades. The images would continue to rest quietly in their folders, holding their stories with patient dignity until someone needed to learn from their accumulated wisdom. In the gentle silence of the evidence room, surrounded by thousands of photographs that had once been crucial to active investigations, Elena felt a deep appreciation for the human stories that these images preserved. Each photograph represented someone's search for justice, someone's moment of accountability, or someone's opportunity for redemption and growth. The archive would continue its quiet mission of preservation, holding these visual memories with the same care that had characterized the police work they documented. In the accumulated wisdom of these forgotten cases, future generations would find lessons about the eternal human challenges of maintaining community safety while preserving individual dignity and hope. Chief Archivist Margaret Holloway descended to the lowest level of the records facility, a place few people had reason to visit, where the oldest and most thoroughly resolved cases rested in climate-controlled silence. Here, in the permanent archive section, files dating back to the 1940s and 1950s had been transferred, after decades of storage in the active police building. Their contents preserved for historical research but no longer needed for ongoing legal proceedings. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Margaret moved through corridors, lined with steel shelving that reached toward the high ceiling. Each shelf contained hundreds of boxes, labeled with dates and case numbers that represented the community's collective memory of how justice had been sought and found over the decades. These were the cases that had reached their final conclusions, where appeals had been exhausted, sentences had been served, and victims had found whatever measure of peace was possible after trauma and loss. Margaret paused at Section J, which contained files from 1952, the year the modern police department had been formally established with professional standards and systematic record-keeping that reflected post-war advances in law enforcement techniques. The boxes in this section represented some of the first cases to be documented with the thoroughness and attention to detail that had become standard practice in subsequent decades. She pulled Box J47, which contained files from the autumn of 1952, including a case that had been significant enough to influence police procedures for years afterward. The Morrison family murder case had shocked the quiet community, involving the deaths of Robert and Helen Morrison in their home on Elm Street during what appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. Detective William Chun had been assigned to lead the investigation, working with state police resources and federal experts who brought new scientific techniques to bear on what was then considered a complex case. The file contained photographs, witness statements, and forensic reports that documented the methodical process of gathering evidence and building a case that would withstand legal scrutiny. The investigation had taken 14 months to complete, with Detective Chun pursuing leads throughout the region and coordinating with law enforcement agencies in neighboring states. The perpetrator, David Torres, had been a drifter with a history of burglary who had apparently chosen the Morrison home at random, unaware that the elderly couple would be present during what he had intended as a simple theft. Margaret read through the final reports, noting how the case had concluded with Torres's conviction and sentencing to life imprisonment, where he had remained until his death from natural causes in 1987. The file contained correspondence between Detective Chun and Torres during the 35 years of his incarceration, revealing an unexpected relationship that had developed between the investigator and the man he had brought to justice. Torres had used his time in prison to obtain his high school diploma and later a college degree, participating in programs that helped him understand the impact of his crimes while developing skills that allowed him to mentor younger inmates who struggled with similar backgrounds of poverty and poor decision-making. Detective Chun had supported these efforts, visiting Torres periodically and writing letters of recommendation for his educational programs. The final entry in the file was a letter from Torres to Detective Chun, written shortly before Torres's death, expressing gratitude for the respectful way he had been treated during the investigation and acknowledging the justice of his conviction. The letter reflected a mature understanding of the harm he had caused and genuine remorse for the pain he had inflicted on the Morrison family and the broader community. Margaret carefully returned the Morrison file to its box and moved to another section containing cases from the 1960s. Here, she found documentation of social changes that had affected both crime patterns and law enforcement approaches during that transformative decade. Box K-23 contained files from 1967, including a case involving civil rights demonstrations that had required delicate handling to balance public safety concerns with constitutional protections for freedom of assembly and expression. The case had involved a planned march through downtown streets to protest segregation in local businesses and housing practices. Police Chief Patricia Davis had worked closely with civil rights leaders to establish protocols that would protect demonstrators while maintaining public order and ensuring that the march could proceed peacefully. Detective Robert Martinez had been assigned a liaison with march organizers, helping to plan the route and timing while also coordinating with businesses and residents who would be affected by street closures and increased foot traffic. His reports documented careful negotiations that addressed security concerns while respecting the demonstrators' rights and the community's broader interests in maintaining peaceful dialogue about important social issues. March had proceeded without serious incident, leading to productive conversations between civil rights leaders and business owners that had resulted in voluntary changes to discriminatory practices. The case file contained photographs of the peaceful demonstration, showing community members of different races walking together through streets that would later become symbols of the community's commitment to racial harmony and social justice. Margaret found these civil rights files particularly moving because they documented moments when the community had chosen dialogue and cooperation over conflict and division. The police department's approach had emphasized protection of constitutional rights rather than suppression of dissent, establishing principles that had guided the community's response to social change for decades afterward. Moving to more recent files, Margaret examined cases from the 1980s and 1990s that had been resolved through new approaches to justice that emphasized restoration and healing rather than purely punitive responses to criminal behavior. Box L-15 contained documentation of the community's first restorative justice program, which had been established in 1989 to address juvenile crime through processes that brought victims, offenders, and community members together to develop solutions that addressed harm while preventing future offenses. The program's first case had involved Marcus Wong, a 16-year-old who had vandalized the community center during a period of family crisis and personal struggle. Rather than processing Marcus through the traditional juvenile court system, Detective Susan Williams had worked with trained facilitators to organize a restorative justice conference that included Marcus, his family, community center staff, and neighborhood residents who had been affected by the vandalism. The conference had revealed that Marcus's destructive behavior was related to his parents' divorce and his difficulty processing the changes in his family situation. Rather than punishing him with detention or fines, the group had developed a plan that included counseling for Marcus, community service at the center he had damaged, and ongoing support from adult mentors who could help him navigate the challenges of adolescence. Margaret read through follow-up reports that documented Marcus's transformation over the following years. He had completed his community service requirements, graduated from high school with improved grades, and eventually attended college on a scholarship. More significantly, he had become an advocate for restorative justice approaches, speaking to other young people about the importance of taking responsibility for their actions while working to repair harm rather than simply enduring punishment. Restorative justice program had expanded over the years to include adult cases and more serious offenses, always with careful attention to victim preferences and community safety concerns. The files documented hundreds of cases where this approach had achieved better outcomes than traditional prosecution, creating healing for victims while providing offenders with opportunities to understand the impact of their actions and make meaningful amends. Asterisk. Margaret moved to the section containing the most recent cases to be transferred to permanent archives. Files from the early 2000s that represented the final evolution of law enforcement approaches that had been developing throughout the previous decades. These cases reflected comprehensive understanding of crime prevention, community policing, and restorative justice that had been learned through generations of experience. Box M8 contained files from 2003, including a complex domestic violence case that had been resolved through coordinated intervention involving police, social services, mental health professionals, and community support organizations. The case had involved the Chun family, where financial stress and alcohol abuse had escalated to violence that threatened the safety of both spouses and their 2 young children. Asterisk. Detective Linda Rodriguez had approached the case with sensitivity to the complex dynamics of domestic violence, understanding that traditional arrest and prosecution might not address the underlying issues that had created the dangerous situation. Working with specialized domestic violence advocates, she had developed a safety plan for the family, while also connecting both spouses with resources that could address their individual and relationship challenges. The resolution had involved Mr. Chun entering alcohol treatment and anger management programs, while Mrs. Chun received counseling and economic support that allowed her to maintain independence and safety for herself and her children. The family had remained together, but with ongoing monitoring and support services that ensured continued safety while addressing the root causes of the violence. Follow-up reports documented the family's progress over several years, showing how comprehensive intervention had prevented further violence while preserving family relationships and protecting the children from additional trauma. Mr. Chun had completed his treatment programs and found stable employment, while Mrs. Chun had completed job training that provided her with economic independence and confidence. These comprehensive approaches to complex social problems represented the culmination of decades of learning about how law enforcement could most effectively serve community needs while respecting individual rights and promoting long-term solutions to recurring problems. Margaret moved to the final section of the permanent archives, where the most recently transferred cases rested in boxes that would probably not be opened again for decades. These were the cases that had reached their complete and final resolution, where all legal proceedings had been exhausted, all sentences had been served, and all restoration had been completed. The silence in this section was profound, representing thousands of human stories that had found their endings in justice, healing, or acceptance. Each box contained dozens of cases where people had faced the consequences of their actions. Victims had found whatever measure of peace was possible, and communities had learned lessons that would guide future responses to similar challenges. Box 1-2 contained one of the final cases to be transferred, a 2005 case involving elderly financial abuse that had been resolved through innovative collaboration between law enforcement, financial institutions, and adult protective services. Mrs. Sarah Martinez, an 83-year-old widow, had been victimized by a caregiver who had gradually gained access to her bank accounts and retirement funds over a period of several months. Detective Michael Torres had investigated the case with patience and sensitivity, understanding that elderly victims of financial abuse often experienced shame and confusion that made them reluctant to report crimes or cooperate with investigations. He had worked with specially trained advocates to build trust with Mrs. Martinez, while gathering evidence that would support prosecution of the caregiver. The case had concluded with the caregiver's conviction and the recovery of most of the stolen funds, but more importantly, it had led to the establishment of enhanced protections for elderly residents and better training for caregivers who worked with vulnerable populations. Mrs. Martinez had received counseling and support that helped her regain confidence in her ability to manage her affairs independently while accepting appropriate assistance from trusted family members and professionals. The final entry in Mrs. Martinez's file was a letter she had written to Detective Torres on her 90th birthday, thanking him for his kindness and reporting that she remained independent and active in her community. The letter reflected the resilience and dignity that characterized many elderly crime victims who received appropriate support and advocacy during their recovery process. Margaret closed the final file box and stood quietly in the permanent archives, surrounded by thousands of completed stories that represented the community's ongoing commitment to justice, healing, and learning. Each case had contributed to the accumulated wisdom that guided current law, enforcement practices, and community responses to crime and conflict. The archives would continue to grow as new cases reached their final resolution and were transferred from active files to permanent storage. Future researchers would examine these records to understand how their community had addressed the eternal challenges of maintaining safety and justice while preserving individual freedom and dignity. In the profound silence of the permanent archives, Margaret felt a deep appreciation for all the people whose work was documented in these files. The law enforcement officers who had investigated crimes with patience and skill, the victims who had found courage to seek justice and healing, the offenders who had accepted responsibility and worked to make amends, and the community members who had supported restorative processes that emphasized redemption and growth. The stories rested peacefully in their boxes, their dramas concluded, their lessons learned, their contributions to the community's collective wisdom preserved for future generations. In the gentle silence of the archives, these forgotten cases continued to offer their quiet testimony to the enduring human capacity for justice, forgiveness, and hope. As Margaret prepared to leave the permanent archives and return to the upper levels where active cases continued their progression toward resolution, she felt a profound sense of completion. The journey through decades of police work had revealed the evolution of a community's understanding of how to balance accountability with compassion, how to maintain safety while promoting healing, and how to learn from past experiences while remaining open to new approaches that better served human needs. The archives would continue their patient mission of preservation, holding these stories with the same care and dignity that had characterized the work they documented. In the accumulated wisdom of thousands of completed cases, future generations would find guidance for addressing the challenges that would inevitably arise in their own pursuit of justice and community safety. The lights in the permanent archives dimmed automatically as Margaret departed, leaving the completed stories to rest in perfect darkness and silence. The cases had found their peace at last, their lessons preserved, their contributions honored, their endings gently accepted in the eternal quiet of the archives, where all stories eventually come to rest. In this deepest sanctuary of memory and wisdom, the work of justice continued its ancient pattern of preservation and guidance, ensuring that the lessons learned through generations of human struggle and growth would remain available to guide future communities in their own efforts to create societies where safety and freedom, accountability and compassion, justice and mercy could coexist in delicate but enduring balance. The final files had been stored, the last stories archived, the ultimate peace achieved. In the gentle silence that followed, the city above continued its restless movement, while the basement archives held their accumulated wisdom in perfect stillness, ready to offer guidance whenever future generations needed to understand how their predecessors had navigated the eternal challenges of creating and maintaining just and peaceful communities. The memorial garden behind the old courthouse had been established in 1995, not as an official police memorial, but as a quiet space where the community could reflect on the complex relationships between justice, healing, and time. Retired Detective Captain Helen Morrison walked slowly along the curved pathways that wound between flowering shrubs and memorial benches, each one representing someone whose life had been touched by the intersection of crime and community response. The garden had grown organically over the years, with new plantings and memorial elements added as families and community members sought ways to acknowledge losses, while celebrating the resilience that had emerged from difficult experiences. Detective Morrison had been instrumental in creating this space during her final years of active service, recognizing that the police department's work extended beyond investigation and enforcement to include support for the healing processes that allowed communities to move forward after traumatic events. The central feature of the garden was a simple fountain surrounded by native plants that changed with the seasons, creating a living calendar that marked the passage of time while providing constant renewal and growth. The gentle sound of water over stone created a natural meditation that helped visitors find the inner quiet necessary for reflection and remembrance. Detective Morrison paused at the bench dedicated to Officer Patricia Chun, who had been killed in a traffic accident while responding to an emergency call in 1987. The bench faced east toward the sunrise, reflecting Patricia's optimistic nature and her belief that each new day brought opportunities for positive change and community building. Fresh flowers had been placed beside the bench, probably by Patricia's sister, who continued to visit regularly, even though 38 years had passed since the accident. Asterisk. The inscription on the bench was simple but profound. She saw possibility in every person and hope in every situation. These words captured not only Patricia's approach to police work, but also the philosophy that had guided the community's evolution toward more restorative and healing-centered approaches to justice over the decades following her death. Moving through the garden, Detective Morrison encountered other memorials that told the story of how the community had learned to honor both victims and those who had worked to serve justice. The Rose Garden section was dedicated to civilians who have lost their lives to criminal violence, with each bush representing someone whose death had motivated changes in law enforcement practices, community safety programs, or victim support services. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez had been murdered during a robbery in 1979, leading to enhanced security programs for elderly residents and the establishment of the community's first victim advocate position. The memorial rose bush planted in her honor bloomed deep red each summer, its vibrant color reflecting the passionate advocacy that her daughter had brought to improving support services for crime victims throughout the region. The memorial for teenage car accident victim Michael Wong, who had died in a crash involving a drunk driver in 1983, was surrounded by plants that attracted butterflies, symbolizing transformation and the brief but meaningful impact that young lives could have on their communities. Michael's death had inspired the community's first comprehensive drunk driving prevention program, including education in schools and increased enforcement that had significantly reduced alcohol-related traffic fatalities. Detective Morrison settled on the central bench that faced the fountain, allowing herself to absorb the peaceful atmosphere that visitors had found healing over the years. This garden represented something beyond traditional memorialization. It was a living testament to the community's ability to transform tragedy into wisdom, loss into learning, and pain into programs that prevented others from experiencing similar harm. The garden also included spaces dedicated to positive transformations that had emerged from the justice system's work. A small grove of fruit trees honored individuals who had committed crimes but had subsequently made significant contributions to community welfare through volunteer work, mentoring programs, or other forms of service that demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and commitment to making amends. David Kim's memorial tree had been planted after his death from cancer in 2001, 23 years after he had been convicted of armed robbery. During his incarceration, David had earned 2 college degrees and had developed literacy programs that helped other inmates prepare for successful reintegration into society. Upon his release, he had continued this work as a volunteer, helping former inmates find employment, and housing while avoiding the circumstances that had led to their criminal behavior. The tree that honored David's transformation bore fruit each autumn, providing a literal harvest that was donated to local food banks while symbolizing how individual change could contribute to broader community nourishment. Detective Morrison had worked with David during his final years, helping him document his rehabilitation programs so that they could continue after his death. The meditation area at the garden center contained stones that had been contributed by families, victims, offenders, and law enforcement officers who had found meaning in their experiences with the justice system. Each stone bore a simple word or phrase that captured some aspect of the journey from harm to healing: forgiveness, accountability, growth, understanding, peace, justice, hope. These stones had been arranged in a spiral pattern that encouraged contemplative walking, while providing a physical representation of how justice processes could lead individuals and communities through cycles of challenge and renewal. Detective Morrison had contributed her own stone many years earlier, inscribed with the word service, reflecting her understanding that law enforcement was fundamentally about serving human needs, rather than simply enforcing rules. The garden's design promoted reflection on the connections between individual actions and community consequences, encouraging visitors to consider how their own choices contributed to either harm or healing in their relationships with others. Educational elements throughout the space provided information about conflict resolution, restorative justice, and community support services that could help people address problems before they escalated into criminal behavior. A small library pavilion contained books and resources about peacemaking, mediation, and trauma recovery, creating opportunities for learning that extended beyond the immediate experience of visiting the memorial space. The pavilion had been funded through donations from families who had found healing through restorative justice processes and wanted to share resources that might help others navigate similar journeys. Detective Morrison opened one of the library's guest books, reading entries from visitors who had found comfort or inspiration during their time in the garden. Many entries came from family members of crime victims who had discovered that healing was possible even after devastating losses. Others were written by former offenders who had found motivation for positive change through contemplating the memorial elements that honored both harm and redemption. One recent entry had been written by Maria Santos, whose son had been killed by a drunk driver 15 years earlier. She wrote about how her initial anger and desire for revenge had gradually transformed into advocacy for drunk driving prevention and support for other grieving families. Her work had prevented additional deaths while providing her with a sense of purpose that honored her son's memory through service to others. Another entry came from Robert Chun, who had committed burglary as a teenager and had returned to the garden 25 years later to reflect on how restorative justice processes had changed the trajectory of his life. He wrote about his current work as a social worker helping at-risk youth, describing how his own experience with accountability and community support had motivated his career choice and shaped his approach to helping young people avoid the mistakes he had made. These personal testimonies filled multiple volumes, creating an informal archive of how individuals and families had found ways to transform their experiences with crime and justice into sources of strength, wisdom, and service to others. The guest books themselves had become part of the memorial, documenting the ongoing human capacity for growth and healing even in the aftermath of serious harm. The seasonal changes in the garden provided natural cycles of renewal that helped visitors understand how grief and healing evolved over time. Spring brought new growth that symbolized hope and possibility. Summer provided full blooms that represented the peak of community support and connection. Autumn offered harvest and reflection on lessons learned, and winter created quiet spaces for deep contemplation and rest. Detective Morrison had visited the garden regularly throughout her retirement, finding in its peaceful atmosphere a place to process her own experiences with the complex emotions that came from a career in law enforcement. She had seen humanity at its worst and best, had witnessed both devastating harm and remarkable redemption, and had learned that justice was not a destination, but an ongoing process of balancing accountability with compassion. The garden provided a physical space for the kind of reflection that was essential for anyone who worked closely with crime and its aftermath. Here, surrounded by living memorials to both loss and transformation, visitors could find perspective on their own experiences while connecting with the broader community's commitment to learning and growth. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the memorial space, Detective Morrison reflected on how the garden represented the ultimate archive, not of documents or photographs, but of wisdom that had been gained through decades of community experience with crime, justice, and healing. Every memorial element told stories about how ordinary people had found extraordinary strength to survive trauma, accept accountability, and work toward solutions that prevented future harm. The garden would continue to evolve as new memorials were added and existing plantings matured, creating a living document of the community's ongoing journey toward more effective and humane approaches to justice. Future generations would find in this space both honoring of past struggles and inspiration for continuing the work of building communities where safety and freedom, accountability and compassion could coexist. The late afternoon light filtering through the memorial trees created patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to dance across the pathways, suggesting the complex interplay of darkness and light that characterized all human experience. In this peaceful setting, even the most difficult stories found their place in a larger narrative of hope and possibility. Detective Morrison rose from her bench and walked slowly toward the garden's exit, carrying with her the sense of completion that came from understanding how individual stories contributed to larger patterns of community growth and healing. The garden would remain as a testament to the enduring human capacity to transform suffering into service, loss into learning, and endings into new beginnings. The memorial space would continue its quiet mission of providing sanctuary for reflection and renewal, holding space for all who sought to understand how justice and healing could emerge from even the most challenging circumstances. In the gentle convergence of memory and hope that characterized this sacred space, visitors would continue to find the peace that came from understanding their own experiences as part of humanity's eternal journey toward greater wisdom and compassion. As evening approached, and the garden settled into its nighttime quiet, the fountain continued its gentle song. The memorial plantings released their subtle fragrances into the cooling air, and the stones that marked so many journeys from harm to healing reflected the last light of day. In this perfect stillness, all stories found their ultimate rest, not as endings but as contributions to the eternal human effort to create communities where every person could live with dignity, safety, and hope. The garden held them all, victims and offenders, officers and advocates, families and communities, in the embracing peace that came from understanding that even the most difficult experiences could contribute to wisdom and growth when approached with patience, commitment, and love. Here, in this quiet sanctuary where time itself seemed to pause, every story found its way home to the deepest peace of all, the recognition that all human experience, however painful or complex, was part of a larger pattern of learning and healing that would continue for generations yet to come. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by the gentle presence of all who had contributed to this community's journey toward justice and peace, Detective Morrison felt the profound satisfaction that came from a lifetime of service to something larger than herself. The stories would continue, the learning would deepen, and the garden would grow, holding space for all who sought to understand how even the most challenging human experiences could contribute to the eternal work of building communities worthy of the hope and dreams that lived in every human heart. Detective Emily Rodriguez arrived at the Central Precinct at 5:47 a.m. 43 minutes before her shift officially began. Carrying a travel mug of coffee and the particular sense of anticipation that came with starting a new case. The building was quiet at this hour, with only the skeleton crew of night, shift officers completing their final reports, and the early custodial staff, preparing the building for another day of serving the communities. Needs for safety and justice. The case file waiting on her desk was thin, containing only the initial incident report and a few photographs taken by the responding officers. Mrs. Grace Chun, an 80-year-old retired teacher, had reported that someone had been entering her home during the day while she was at her weekly medical appointments, taking small items and leaving subtle signs of disturbance that suggested careful, methodical intrusion rather than random burglary. Detective Rodriguez opened the file and began reading Officer Michael Torres's initial report, noting the careful attention to detail that characterized his documentation. Mrs. Chen lived alone in a 2-story house on Riverside Avenue that she had shared with her late husband for 46 years before his death from cancer 8 months earlier. The house was well maintained and located in a neighborhood where residents knew each other and watched out for unusual activity. The first incident had occurred 3 weeks earlier, when Mrs. Chun returned from her Tuesday morning appointment with her cardiologist to find that several family photographs had been moved from their usual positions on the mantelpiece. Nothing had been taken, but the photographs had been arranged differently, as if someone had been examining them closely before attempting to return them to their original positions. Mrs. Chun had initially dismissed this as evidence of her own forgetfulness, recognizing that grief and aging could affect memory and spatial awareness in ways that might explain small changes in her familiar environment. But when similar disturbances occurred during each of the following weeks, always on Tuesday mornings while she was away from home, she had decided to contact the police. Detective Rodriguez studied the photographs that Officer Torres had taken during his initial visit to Mrs. Chun's home. The house showed the careful organization that came from decades of shared domestic life, with each room arranged to accommodate the routines and preferences of two people who had learned to live together harmoniously. The recent loss of Mrs. Chun's husband was evident in small details: a single coffee cup in the kitchen, reading glasses on only one side of the bed, and the general sense of space that seemed too large for its current occupant. The items that had been disturbed suggested that the intruder was searching for something specific, possibly documents or valuables that might be kept in locations that seemed significant to someone familiar with how elderly people typically stored important papers. Photographs had been moved, desk drawers had been opened and carefully closed, and Mrs. Chun's address book had been found in a different room from where she normally kept it. Detective Rodriguez made notes about the patterns she observed in the case, recognizing that crimes targeting elderly residents often reflected intimate knowledge of their routines and vulnerabilities. The timing of the intrusions, always during Mrs. Chun's medical appointments, suggested that someone knew her schedule and was taking advantage of predictable absences from her home. The investigation would require patience and sensitivity, acknowledging that elderly crime victims often experienced violations of their personal space as particularly traumatic, events that could affect their sense of safety and independence. Detective Rodriguez had developed expertise in working with older residents during her 12 years with the department, understanding how to build trust while gathering information that might be crucial to solving cases that affected vulnerable populations. Her first step would be to interview Mrs. Chun more thoroughly, exploring not only the specific incidents she had reported, but also any changes in her social environment that might have created opportunities for someone to learn about her routines and gain access to her home. The investigation would also require careful examination of physical evidence that might have been left by the intruder, though the subtle nature of the disturbances suggested someone who was experienced in avoiding detection. Detective Rodriguez gathered her notebook and camera equipment, preparing for the drive to Riverside Avenue, where she would begin the methodical process of gathering information that would eventually either resolve the case or determine that no crime had actually occurred. Either outcome would require the same careful attention to detail and respect for Mrs. Chun's concerns that characterized effective police work with elderly residents. The morning commute through the Awakening City provided time for Detective Rodriguez to consider the various possibilities that might explain Mrs. Chun's situation. Home care workers, delivery personnel, or maintenance contractors might have legitimate access to the house while taking advantage of that access to search for valuables or personal information. Family members or neighbors might be concerned about Mrs. Chun's ability to live independently and might be monitoring her situation in ways that created the disturbances she had noticed. More troubling possibilities included deliberate targeting by criminals who specialized in exploiting elderly residents, either for immediate theft or as preparation for more serious crimes, such as identity theft or financial fraud. Detective Rodriguez had investigated several such cases during her career, learning to recognize the patterns that distinguished legitimate concern from criminal exploitation. The Riverside neighborhood was already showing signs of morning activity as Detective Rodriguez arrived at Mrs. Chun's address. Dog walkers were completing their early routes, newspaper deliveries were being made to front porches, and the first commuters were beginning their drives to work in the downtown business district. The normal rhythm of suburban life provided both opportunities and challenges for criminals who might be seeking to operate undetected in residential areas. Mrs. Chun's house stood on a corner lot with mature landscaping that provided privacy while also creating potential concealment for someone approaching the property without being observed. Detective Rodriguez noted the sightlines from neighboring houses, the location of windows and doors that might provide access points, and the general security features that might either deter or facilitate unauthorized entry. Mrs. Chun answered the door promptly when Detective Rodriguez rang the bell, suggesting that she had been watching for the detective's arrival. She was a small, neatly dressed woman who moved with the careful deliberation that often came with aging, but spoke with the clear authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. Her career as an elementary school teacher had apparently provided her with skills for observing details and communicating effectively with people who needed information or assistance. The interior of Mrs. Chun's home reflected the same attention to order and detail that Detective Rodriguez had observed in the initial photographs. Every room showed evidence of careful maintenance and thoughtful arrangement, creating an environment that would make any disturbance immediately noticeable to someone familiar with the normal placement of objects and furniture. Mrs. Chun led Detective Rodriguez through the house, pointing out the specific locations where items had been moved during each of the Tuesday morning incidents. Her descriptions were precise and consistent, suggesting either accurate observation or carefully constructed deception. Detective Rodriguez listened carefully while also observing Mrs. Chun's demeanor and the physical evidence that might support or contradict her account of the disturbances. The living room contained the family photographs that had been the first evidence of intrusion, arranged on a mantelpiece above a fireplace that served as the room's focal point. Mrs. Chun explained how each photograph had been moved slightly from its usual position, as if someone had been examining them closely before attempting to replace them without obvious signs of disturbance. Detective Rodriguez studied the photographs, noting that they provided a comprehensive visual history of the Chun family over several decades. Wedding pictures, graduation ceremonies, holiday gatherings, and vacation trips created a detailed record of family relationships and significant life events. Someone searching for information about Mrs. Chun's background, financial situation, or family connections might find valuable clues in these carefully preserved memories. The dining room contained a china cabinet where Mrs. Chun stored valuable dishes and serving pieces that had been wedding gifts or family heirlooms. Several pieces had been moved during the most recent incident, again suggesting careful examination rather than random disturbance. The items that had been moved were among the most valuable in the collection, indicating that the intruder possessed knowledge about antiques or collectibles that might be worth stealing. Mrs. Chun's home office contained the desk where she managed household finances and correspondence, including the address book that had been found in the kitchen after one of the intrusions. Detective Rodriguez examined the desk area carefully, noting that papers had been disturbed but not obviously searched, creating the impression that someone had been looking for specific documents while trying to avoid creating obvious evidence of their presence. The investigation would require not only analysis of the physical evidence, but also exploration of Mrs. Chun's social connections and daily routines that might have provided someone with information about her schedule and vulnerabilities. Detective Rodriguez began asking careful questions about Mrs. Chun's regular activities, the service providers who had access to her home, and any recent changes in her social environment that might have created opportunities for the incidents she had reported. Mrs. Chun's Tuesday morning medical appointments had been scheduled at the same time for several months, creating a predictable pattern that someone familiar with her routine could exploit for unauthorized access to her home. Her cardiologist's office was located 15 minutes away by car, and her appointments typically lasted an hour, providing a reliable window of opportunity for someone who knew her schedule. The medical appointments had been arranged through her primary care physician's office, where scheduling information might be accessible to office staff or other patients who had reason to be familiar with appointment procedures. Mrs. Chun also participated in a senior transportation service that provided rides to medical appointments for elderly residents who preferred not to drive, creating additional opportunities for someone to learn about her schedule. Detective Rodriguez made notes about all the potential sources of information that might have allowed someone to learn about Mrs. Chun's routine, while also considering the possibility that the timing of the incidents was coincidental rather than evidence of deliberate planning. Effective investigation required consideration of all possibilities while maintaining focus on the most likely explanations for the evidence that had been observed. The interview with Mrs. Chun continued for over an hour, with Detective Rodriguez gathering detailed information about each incident while also learning about Mrs. Chun's background, family situation, and social connections that might be relevant to understanding her current circumstances. The conversation revealed a woman who remained sharp and observant despite her age, someone whose reports of disturbance deserved careful investigation rather than dismissal as confusion or forgetfulness. Mrs. Chun had lived in the neighborhood for over 4 decades, developing relationships with neighbors and local business owners that provided her with a support network of people who were familiar with her situation and concerned about her welfare. These relationships would be valuable resources for the investigation, providing additional perspectives on any unusual activities that might have been observed in the area. The case represented the beginning of what might become a complex investigation, requiring coordination with other agencies and careful attention to the specific vulnerabilities that affected elderly residents living alone. Detective Rodriguez understood that crimes targeting seniors often revealed broader patterns of exploitation that might affect multiple victims and require comprehensive responses that addressed both immediate safety concerns and underlying social issues. As Detective Rodriguez prepared to leave Mrs. Chun's house and begin the broader investigation, she reflected on how this new case would eventually join the thousands of others that had been documented, investigated, and resolved during her department's long history of serving the community. The thin file on her desk that morning would gradually grow thicker as evidence was gathered, witnesses were interviewed, and the patient work of investigation revealed whatever truth lay behind Mrs. Chun's careful observations. The case might be resolved quickly if obvious explanations emerged, or it might require weeks or months of investigation if the situation proved more complex than initial appearances suggested. Regardless of how long the investigation took, Detective Rodriguez was committed to providing Mrs. Chun with the thorough attention that all community members deserved when they brought their concerns to the police department. The morning sun was rising higher as Detective Rodriguez returned to her car, beginning the process of investigation that would eventually transform Mrs. Chun's worried observations into either criminal charges against a perpetrator or reassurance that no crime had actually occurred. In either case, the investigation would be documented with the same care that had characterized police work in this community for generations, adding another story to the vast archive of human experience that filled the filing cabinets in the basement of the Central Precinct. The new case had begun its journey through the machinery of justice, starting with a concerned citizen's careful observations and continuing with a detective's patient commitment to uncovering the truth. Like all the cases that had come before it, Mrs. Chun's situation would be investigated with thoroughness and compassion, contributing to the community's ongoing effort to maintain safety and security for all residents regardless of their age or circumstances.